This happened when I was around 9 years old. I'm 25 now, and it's something I will never forget. It gives me goosebumps to this day. I live in a terraced house, 4 houses combined, and my neighborhood and I each have our own little patio. There's a small road 10 meters from my yard where people do their Sunday walks on. Only a small fence separates my yard and patio from that road. I live in a pretty crowded area with several of these terraced houses spread around in my neighborhood, so seeing people walking on that road is pretty normal for me. Seeing random people standing on my patio is not. When I was 9, I usually got home from school about an hour before my mum got home from work. I live maybe 50 meters away from school, so my mum figured I was mature enough to be home alone for around an hour before she got home. This one day, I got home from school. I did the usual thing, which was to make sure I locked the front door and double-checked that the back door leading to the patio was also locked. I was 9. Being alone was a little scary, even though it was in the middle of the day and only for an hour. I then rushed to my room upstairs to play as much PlayStation as possible before my mum came home and made me do homework. While playing, I heard this noise coming from outside my window, as my room was located 1 floor over the patio, with a view to the road, as I told you about before. It was kind of like the sound of cats, but my cats had been missing for over 3 months. Hope sparked and I thought, oh my god, did he finally come back? I ran downstairs to check if it was my cat, but the sight that met me still gives me goosebumps to this day. There was a guy standing on my patio, a tall guy with black hair covering half of his eyes, making him look like the male version of the girl from The Ring. I could hear him making high-pitched sounds, almost like a cat meowing. A brown liquid was running down his mouth. I could see him spitting out my dad's stomped cigarettes. He was actually eating them from the ashtray. I was frozen observing this. Eventually, snapped out of it and screamed so loudly that the man must have heard it. He didn't react. He kept on eating from the ashtray. I ran upstairs to my room, locked the door and called my mum, who then called the cops. I have never been more terrified in my life, laying in bed under my sheets, shivering with fear, as I hear this creepy guy make those horrible noises whilst eating cigarette stumps from the ashtray on the patio. I kind of blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I remember is the police arriving on the road by my yard. I hear them talking to the guy, saying stuff like, "What are you doing? Get over here or we'll come down and arrest you," and so on. He didn't respond, but the high-pitched sound was more frequent and louder. I decided to look through the window, feeling safe now that the cops were there. I could see 2 police officers standing by my fence, 1 man and a woman. I didn't see the creepy man, however, because he was standing directly 1 story under me and my field of view. The police jumped the fence, and I remember hearing the creepy guy screaming louder than anything I've ever heard before. He charged the female police officer with full force, and he knocked her out cold. The male police officer immediately then tased the guy, leaving him shaking on the ground, screaming still. The policeman struggled to keep him on the ground while putting handcuffs on him, but eventually made it. After a while, he managed to wake up the female police officer, who seemed to be badly hurt. He called for backup and an ambulance, and then he sees me standing in the window above him. The expression on my face must have been something else, because he just looked at me and said, "I sure as hell hope you didn't see all of that." I started to cry. By this time, neighbors started to arrive, wondering what the hell was going on. One of my neighbors, an elderly woman, made me come down, and she took care of me until my mum got back. The police took the creepy guy with them in the car and left. Before they left, they promised to come back and talk to us about what had happened. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The male police officer came back later that night and sat down with me and my mum to talk. He explained that the guy on my patio was actually diagnosed with severe autism. He had escaped a facility where mentally challenged people lived, located around 5 kilometers from where I live. He explained that the guy had actually been living in my house 5 years ago, but had been forced to move when his mum, his only caretaker, died. The poor guy probably thought he would find his mum in my house. He missed the routines, and he missed living there with his mum. The police had to move him from the house that time 5 years ago, because he was extremely strong. From what I heard, he has extreme tensions in the body because of his autism, making his muscles grow stronger and stronger throughout the years. This was the reason he reacted the way he did when the police came that day. Still frightened, I told the police officer that he needed to make sure this would never happen again, and he promised it wouldn't. After a few sleepless nights, my life got back to normal. 3 years went by and the guy didn't come back, until a year ago. This time my mum and dad had moved out. I bought the house from them, and I'm still living there today. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the patio when I see this random guy stopping on the road by my fence. He stands there, looking at me. I look at him and give him a nod, and then I hear the high-pitched noises. Oh shit, that's him. His hair had turned grey, but the high-pitched sounds made me realize. My heart started racing, and I instantly remembered the reason why he was back. I realized that he must have managed to escape again, but I kept my cool a bit longer, because back then I was 9. I started to feel sorry for this guy. 16 years later, and he was back to look for his mum. I decided to carefully ask him if he wanted to come down to the patio. He instantly jumped the fence, and I started to think he would knock me out like he did to that police officer. He didn't. He smiled, I smiled, and I offered him to sit down. He didn't respond. I offered him to come inside, and he started laughing. We went in, and his face lit up with pure joy. He was home. It reminded him of the life he had with his mum. It almost made me tear up. All of a sudden he sat down on my couch, turned on the TV, and switched directly to the cartoons. I observed him for a while. He was just completely focused on the cartoons. I just wanted him to enjoy the moment, so I didn't say anything to him. I realized I had to call the facility to let them know. The caretakers arrived 10 minutes later, and after a lot of convincing he got back up, crying, and they went back to the facility. I called the facility 2 days later, and we made a deal. His name is Tom, and I now consider Tom my friend. Every Sunday from the day he returned, Tom and his caretakers will visit me to watch cartoons. They say it's the highlight of his week. It makes my heart warm. Now, for several years, my thoughts were, let's not meet guy on the patio eating from the ashtray. Now my thoughts are, let's meet every Sunday to watch cartoons. My friend, Tom. There are 2 stories that I have that both give me shivers, both of which came from my grandma's house. I went to my grandma's place to help her move after the loss of my grandfather. Things were a little emotional. Either way, there was one night where I woke up with a pain in my chest. I woke up and waited for it to go away. It took about 30 minutes, but it did. Then I realized I really had to take a piss. Really bad. I went and took my piss with no problem. Here's where the scary part hits. My grandma has a long-ass hallway. Like, if I had to guess, I would probably say it was about 40 to 50 yards of hallway. It always just made me feel uneasy. Well, this time when I walked down it, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end, and I felt as if I were being watched. I turned the light on and it made me feel a little bit more at ease. I walked out to the bathroom, and after taking literally the biggest, most relieving piss of my life, I walked back to the end of the hallway. I turned the light back off, and at the other end of the hallway I saw a dark figure just standing there. It felt like it was just staring at me. I turned the light back on, and there was nothing there. I turned it back off, and there it was again. I peeped a little, and I slept in my car for the rest of the night. This second time was more recent. We didn't immediately sell the house after my grandma moved. We remodeled it to make it more modern. So I went by to check on the stuff and ended up staying the night. I went to go to sleep and did all the normal stuff. Turned the lights off, closed the door, and started to hear tapping coming from the corner of the room. I turned the light back on, and the tapping stopped. I repeated this process for 20 minutes, until I just got over it and ignored the tapping. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway and the sound of something dragging along the ground. About 5 minutes later I started hearing drums. I noped out of there and boarded the Nope train to the Nopathorn and haven't gone back since. I want to say we sold that house recently. I tried talking to my grandma about the stuff, but there was an experience she had forever and a half ago that changed her outlook on the supernatural, and now she just leaves it alone. She literally turns ghost white whenever we talk about it. My grandma and grandpa spent some of their spare time hunting lost treasures. One that they were working on was located in a place called the Black Hills, or Mountains. This place was out near Winslow, Arizona. The treasure was a large amount of gold taken by Spanish conquistadors. As the story goes, these conquistadors all wound up dying in the hills and mountains. These mountains also were considered sacred by the local Native American tribe. Anyway, my grandparents managed to pinpoint the exact location of where this loot was, and they set out with a pair of friends to check it out. They couldn't get to where they needed to go, so they decided they would simply mark the trail and come back another day. That night at around 1 or 2 in the morning, my grandmother woke up for no explained reason. She said she felt uneasy and woke up. She then explained that in the doorway there was an apparition of a Spaniard in conquistador armor staring at her. She then said that he said in Spanish something along the lines of, if she were to return to the mountains, she would die and her family would be cursed. What made this even more interesting is her friend had the exact same experience on the exact same night around the same time. They were able to pretty much match their stories to a T without any prior conversation on the issue. Plus, on top of that, my grandfather worked for the railroad, and the reason they couldn't go any further into the mountains was because my grandfather and his friend needed to get to work to haul freight that night, and was in a different state by the time this happened to her. The thing is, he also had the exact same thing happen to him as well. After that night, they simply didn't talk about the supernatural that much. This story is from years ago, and I couldn't bring myself to ask my grandma about it again. The look on her face is haunting. In high school, I had the basement bedroom all to myself. We lived in a 2-story home that was no more than 40 years old, but it always felt older to me because my grandparents had lived there before my family moved in. The first year in the house was my first year of high school, and I loved having a room all to myself. I had been sharing a room with one or more siblings my whole life up until now. There were 4 doors in my room, one that led to a bathroom, one that led to one of the main rooms of the basement, one for a small walk-in closet, and one that led to a small, unfinished storage room with a drain in the middle of it. The sprinkler system controls were located in the small storage room, which I always thought was a weird place for them, given that it was the furthest point in the whole house from being near the outside. I should also mention that our basement had those small windows that are located near the ceiling and are just big enough for a person to crawl through if need be. Although, other than letting a bit of light in, they were useless, as they had been painted when the house was built and were basically sealed shut from the paint. On the outside, the windows were 2 to 3 feet below ground level, in wells that were covered in plastic domes. That first year of high school was quite an experience for me. I was homeschooled through 7th grade and then moved after my 8th grade year, so I was in a new place and social anxiety had always been a bit of a problem for me, and still is. But at that point in my life, I chalked it up to all the fear and weirdness I felt to just being a weird kid. I also suffered from depression all throughout high school, and to make an attempt at battling that, I tried to keep myself involved in as many things as possible. I did everything from sports to clubs to plays/musicals, and at the peak of certain seasons, I would have days where I would leave for wrestling practice at 4:30 a.m. and not get home until 10:30 p.m. or later after musical practice got out. Needless to say, I was exhausted a lot of the time, or at least tired enough that I should have slept like a baby. That's why it was weird when I started waking up in the middle of the night on a regular basis. It started out as just being an occasional thing, and sometimes it was obvious reasons, like having a bad dream, or if someone used the main floor bathroom, which was really loud with the pipes being just above my head. Then, about a month before the end of the school year, there was a night where I awoke, terrified for no reason, and it took me a while to calm myself down before I eventually got back to sleep. When I woke up next morning, I tried to recount the experience, and I figured that it must have just been a bad dream that I couldn't remember. The rest of the week was perfectly fine, but that weekend, I experienced the same thing, waking up panicked, breathing heavy, and sweating, and this time I knew for sure that I had not been dreaming. I looked at my alarm clock, 3:23 a.m. Again, it took some time to calm down and get back to sleep. For quite some time, I just laid there staring at the wall, wondering what had happened to me. Another week went by, and I continued to wake up every few nights, sometimes with the same overwhelming feeling of dread, sometimes slowly, almost so slow that I started to question whether I had been asleep in the first place. The weirdest, and what was starting to become the most concerning part of it for me, as I have a religious background, was that I would look at my clock every time I woke up frightened, and literally every single time, it would be 3:23 a.m. School ended, and I continued having these episodes, to the point where I would wake up a few nights a week, and being the weird kid that I was, I didn't think to tell my parents. It became a normal thing for me, so I learned to deal with it when it happened. It didn't seem so bad until I had a face to put with the fear. At this point, it was early into my second year of high school. The fact that I was waking up so much at nighttime wasn't seemingly having much effect on me at school. My grades were fine, and I still had plenty of energy to keep up with all the activities I was involved in. One way I found more consistent sleep was staying at friends' houses. I had a good amount of close friends, and I would spend a lot of nights at their houses, because I found I wouldn't wake up randomly at night when I wasn't in my own room. There was one night in December of that year that I was planning on staying at my best friend's house. We had been hanging out at my house for the afternoon, but we were planning on heading over to his place later to do our typical stay up late, play video games, and drink way too much Mountain Dew, as it was finally the weekend. What I didn't plan on was my dad getting super pissed off about some stupid thing and taking his anger out on me, in the form of driving my best friend home and not letting us hang out anymore that night. I went with my dad and my best friend, sitting in the back of the car sulking and building up my own anger at my dad at the unfairness of the situation. We were on the highway, about halfway to my friend's house, when I had this incredible urge to just open the door and jump out of the car. This really freaked me out, because I had never had that urge to do something like that before, even with my depression. Startled, I looked to the front of the car and away from the window, and immediately regretted it. Besides my dad and my friend sitting in the front of the SUV, I was the only other person in the car. But when I looked up, I saw myself in the rearview mirror, and behind me there was another face, clouded in shadow, just inches from mine. I whipped around and almost yelled out, but there was nothing there. I didn't want to say anything to my dad given the current situation. I spent the rest of the drive constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see whatever the hell that was again. When we got back to our house, I pretty much just went straight to bed, just wanting the day to be over, but it was far from it. 3:23 a.m. There it was again. The time I had become too used to seeing. I tried to breathe deeply. I tried to tell myself it's just some weird thing happening with your body and you'll grow out of it. I turned over and began the process of falling back to sleep. But that's when I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet for my house. Eerily quiet, especially with the lack of outside noise, because of the time of year and the snow on the ground. I lay there on my side, staring at the wall with my back to the rest of the room, straining to hear anything in the silence. The only sound I could make out was the soft thump of my own heartbeat, which for some reason was getting faster and heavier. The dread was returning. The sick twist in my gut that I had become accustomed to this time of night, but had always been able to fight off before. I continued trying to control my breathing and tell myself that my growing fear was irrational, but the feeling was increasing, welling up in my chest and taking over any other feelings of comfort that I managed to establish. That's when I heard another noise. The sound of my pulse dropped out as I strained again to catch what else I was sensing. Unmistakable horror reached my ears and my chest at the same time. Footsteps, slow and soft on my carpeted floor, and approaching my bed. I have never understood the phrase frozen in fear until that moment. I wanted so badly to turn and face whatever this thing was that had been torturing me, but my body would not move. I continued to listen to the footsteps getting closer and closer, and I did the only thing I could, squeezing my eyes shut and muttering a prayer, convinced that the supernatural help was the only thing that could save me at this point. I stopped the prayer, realizing suddenly that all was silent again. The footsteps were gone, and I felt control of my body returning. I still lay on my side, listening for any sound of the sinister presence that I still felt nearby. After a few long moments, I finally rolled over to see an empty room, illuminated only by the light of the small window across from my bed. There was still something wrong though. There was a strange shadow in the light. I looked up to the window, and the horror returned. Just outside the window was the face from earlier that night, sitting there staring down at me. Even though the lights from behind it should have made it impossible to see, I could make out the eyes, dark and empty, and the most skin-crawling smile I have ever seen. Again, I was frozen with fear. I managed to pull my covers up, till all that was showing were my eyes, and the face and I stared at each other. I don't remember what thoughts were going through my head at that point, just the feeling of absolute terror of what I was seeing. At some point in this staring contest from hell, I blinked, and it was gone. I stayed up staring at the window the rest of the night, until I finally passed out from exhaustion. Upon waking up the next morning, I went and checked the window. There were no tracks, or snow, or anything. It appeared as though the plastic dome had been removed. The events of that night did finally give me the push to talk to my parents about it, and they assured me I was probably having nightmares, and getting in my own head about it all, and if anyone was trying to break in, the security system or the dog would make sure that we all knew it was happening. I still don't know what it was, but I'm convinced it wasn't just something in my head. Since high school, I still wake up at night inexplicably, although these days I don't even bother to check the time anymore. But I feel like I know what time it would be if I did. 3:23 a.m. This was in 1976. I was laying in bed, trying to fall asleep. I lived alone. In the dark, I saw a young girl walk into the bedroom, walk over to me, and close her hands around my wrist. I freaked. She vanished. On another night, I tried falling asleep. I saw a woman walk into the bedroom along the foot of my bed, and I thought she was gone. I went to roll over, and my moving elbow bumped into someone in bed with me. You know the feeling of a body in bed? As soon as I realized that, and had that shot of fear, the person vanished, and I was able to finish rolling over. Nobody in the way any longer. I finished my lease with the living room light on all night, to shine into the bedroom. Then I moved across town. In my new apartment, I'd sleep on the living room sofa on weekends, and slept facing the back of the sofa, with my back to the open room. In the middle of the night, sleeping soundly, my eyes popped open in the darkness, and I was completely awake, and with a notion to look over my shoulder. So I did, and saw some figure in the dark standing next to me, a bit hunched over as if on its hands and knees, and watching me sleep. This person had no feet. Half of him faded out below the knees. I swept my arm outwards to touch whoever this was, but the person mildly stepped back out of reach of my sweep. Still lying on the sofa, I reached a bit further, but the person stepped back once again. Getting annoyed, I jumped off the sofa and chased the person across the living room saying, "I've got you now," and I swept my arm through it. It faded out. It was actually a very cool visual effect, my arm passing through as it faded out. Still annoyed, I turned on the lamp, checked my watch, and it was exactly 3 a.m. at this moment. I turned off the lamp and went to sleep again on the sofa. The next morning when I thought about it, that's when I got really scared. Bit of background. This occurred about 3 years ago, when I was 22 years old, and I was working at a fast food place with fried chicken galore. I had been working at fried chicken restaurant for about a year. During that time, an older coworker, who I'll refer to as CC, or Chicken Creeper, would get very friendly with me. I believe this man was in his mid-30s at the time, about 5'8", and of Latino descent. He was actually a shift leader, so would be in charge of me during shifts. I thought he was a relatively nice guy at first, until he started getting too chummy with me. It would start out completely innocent. He'd make friendly conversation with me about various topics, and I would do the same. I actually liked working with him in the beginning. He was easy to talk to, and wouldn't berate me if I made a few mistakes while working. I would also vent to him about annoying customers that I had to serve. Well, after he had gotten comfortable with me, he would get touchy. He would poke my side sometimes and my stomach. I don't particularly like older men touching me like that, especially if he's my supervisor at work. Almost everyone at my workspace, though, would act very close to one another, so I assumed it meant nothing, despite my discomfort. He would often poke me when no one else was around, which should have alerted me to how creepy his actions were. He would later make comments to me about how pretty I was, and would ask questions about my boyfriend and I regularly. Simply questions like, do you live together? You gonna get married soon? How old is he? Stuff like that. There was one night that I came in to pick up my check from work. It was my day off, and I was wearing makeup and a short, spaghetti string dress. One of my shift leaders greeted me as I went to get my check. CC was also working and came out to say hi. He noticed my outfit and said I looked sexy. Ew. I'd rather not have my supervisor refer to me as sexy, please. I just smiled and chuckled awkwardly, got my check, and left. There would be other times when I was working that he would get way too close to me and would stroke my face with his hand. I shivered and found an excuse to walk away. At this time I was wondering if I should say something to my manager. There were cameras at work everywhere, so maybe some of his creepy antics were caught on video. I decided against it though, and would confide in my friends about it instead. They also found Cece's actions creepy, and said that I should tell my boyfriend about it. I didn't really feel I had to though, because I didn't think that Cece had done much harm yet. I also really hate conflict, and thought that my boyfriend would try and convince me to tell my manager. A few weeks before I had decided to leave the fried chicken place, Cece did something I found very inappropriate. I was working that day and had just ended my shift. We were allowed to have drinks from the soda dispenser machine using the restaurant to-go cups, as long as we kept them in the walk-in freezer in the back. I had gotten a drink that day, and walked to the back to finish it off and throw the cup away, because I hate when people just leave their cups there for others to dispose of. Little did I know though that Cece was in there as well. I had started to avoid being alone in secluded parts of the restaurant with him, because that's usually when he would try and touch me. I was startled when I saw him, because I didn't see him walk into there beforehand. He asked me if I was leaving for the day, to which I replied, yeah, I am. Why? Why can't you stay a little longer? He would often ask me this when I was done working for the day, and I'd always say, because I'm tired and want to go home and sleep. He would usually just say, okay, bye. But this time he did something different. This time, he walked over to me and kissed me on the forehead. This disturbed me. But being so non-confrontational, I just smiled weakly, grabbed the cup, and hurried out. I told a couple of friends about this, and they got upset with me, and found Cece pretty revolting for doing this. They again told me to tell my boyfriend, but I didn't want to upset him, and kept it to myself. I eventually told him about a year later, and he was shocked and upset that I had not told him this while it was happening. I told him I didn't want to tell him because I thought he might try to confront Cece or my manager about it. I feel the saddest part about this was that he was actually married with children, and that she worked alongside us as well. His wife was also a shift leader, and I always found her pleasant to work with. I honestly didn't even know Cece was married, let alone that she was working nearby with us all this time. I was so surprised when she had told me while we were working together. She had mentioned she has a husband, and I asked her how long they were together. She said 15 years, and that they'd been working together in the same chicken place all this time. Astonished, I then asked her who her husband was, and she said it was Cece. Really? Yeah, how did you not know that? She said. I said people didn't really ask questions, because I don't like prying into personal lives unless they are okay with it. She then stated how they had 3 kids as well. I felt so guilty about it, wondering if I should tell her about her husband's flirtatious, wretched ways. I decided against it though, feeling it might strain their marriage, and fearing she might not believe me anyway. To my Kentucky Fried Creeper, I hope we never meet again. I used to work as a nanny, and was working with my last family before I took off, as I worked right up until I had my son. Their house was in a subdivision that had been built up in a field, and from the very beginning, I heard strange things. It was a 2-story home, and when the kids and I were downstairs, we would hear footsteps from the upstairs floor. They sounded like running, light and quickly paced. Now the family owned a largish dog with an incredibly fat cat as well, so I always chalked it up to them being responsible. One day though, I heard the steps when the pets were both in the living room. The younger boy of 2 was upstairs napping, and the steps were running from his room to his parents' room, where he was supposedly asleep. I walked up quietly to check up on him, expecting to have to lay him back down, and instead saw a small blonde boy in just a diaper. These kids were Mexican. He looked at me, ran and giggled, and ran into the 2nd bedroom closet. It was winter, cold, and he was mostly naked, so I ran in after him to figure out what was happening. He wasn't there. From then, I saw him probably 5 more times in the time I worked there. I heard the running every day multiple times, and the kids talked to and spoke about him often. Another time, the 2 were playing in his bedroom, while I did some preschool reading with his sister. He ran screaming back to me, which was incredibly rare, as he was the most chilled out child in the world. He literally screamed himself hoarse before I could calm him down, and when he finally did, he was crying about the bald man. I told him to describe him, and he couldn't, so he drew me a picture. It was a tall, black shape that went to the ceiling, standing in the corner of his room, on his bed. When I checked, there was nothing there, But of course it wasn't the last time the bald man was involved. The parents I worked for had trouble getting the second child to sleep in his room after that, so his room was generally empty until they moved a few months later. Twice when I was there for early mornings, there was a very distinct black shape standing in his bedroom. It was pressed against the glass and had one hand raised. Just a few days ago, I was home, minding my own business, studying for an exam. I was kind of stressed out and couldn't really focus on anything. It was midday. The doorbell rang, so I got up and opened the door. There was a man, mid-30s, average build, who looked like a construction worker. He asked me if my parents were home because he needs $50 to fix a pipe. I told him no, they're not, and he asked me when they were coming. I told him I lived with my boyfriend, and I asked why does he need money, since we'd just paid $35 to the building administration. He said those are for other things, and that this is an emergency, that my neighbors had called him because on our side of the building, the eaves were broken and the water was dripping on the windows. He then asked me to talk to my boyfriend about the money, and I told him to come back later because he wasn't home. He told me to ask him when he was coming back because the problem needs urgent care. I closed the door, grabbed my phone, and asked him. Red flag. Is it a pipe or the eaves that are broken? I wanted to ask him which neighbors had called him, if he could give me a receipt, and exactly how much this was going to cost. But at this point I had gotten a little scared. I'm a 100-pound girlie. I actually look like a kid, which is why he asked for my parents, even though I'm 22. The way he talked was also weird. I don't know how to describe it. It just had a mean/crazy vibe to it. So, you know, he could have knocked me over with the door. I also felt incredibly stupid to have told him I was home alone, but he kept asking to talk to the other people. It was my first instinct. Anyway, my boyfriend said he would come home in an hour. I didn't tell him the whole story because the guy was waiting outside. I opened the door again, and I decided I would rather talk to him than make him angry by not opening the door. The door to our apartment is an old wooden door. We live in a cheap rented apartment, so I didn't feel protected enough by it. There I am. I open the door and tell him it's going to be an hour till he comes back, and that I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. He says it's all right, and that he'll come back later. Except he didn't leave immediately. He asked me about our rent, if we worked, if we were students, to which I barely replied. I work, we're both students. I can't give you any more details. I can't tell you the amount of money I pay for my rent. He then proceeded to ask me if I knew other girls such as myself, who were cute and looking for a partner. Someone 25 to 30 years old. That he's a good guy, a city guy, and it's really hard to find a good girl. He probably took about 5 minutes to explain this and grill me for telephone numbers of girls who would not hang up on him. I tried to be as nice as possible and explained to him I only had friends my age and that they were all in relationships as far as I knew. He asked me a couple of more times, but I kept telling him the same thing, so he gave up. He asked me if my boyfriend and I had been together for long, to which I replied that we'd been together for 2 years. He wished us good luck, and something that would translate to, "May you have a future long marriage." He asked me in which apartment the administrator lived, and when I told him, he finally left. I told my boyfriend everything, and he came home as swiftly as he was able. By this point, I felt like puking. I was so scared. I had given away too much info while trying to keep him calm. He immediately said it was a scam and went downstairs to talk to the administrator. She told him he had knocked on her door and asked her for $15, and that the girl on the 3rd floor, me, had sent him. She also told him she knew he was a scammer, and not to worry, just to be careful. I am scared. It seems like he's planning a robbery, like he's gotten into the building as someone must have opened the door for him. He's inspected the doors and chose ours because, well, it's not the best door. He asked for money to see if we had it on hand. He asked for the price of rent to see if we have money and if the stuff in the apartment is of value. Maybe we've been tagged. Or maybe asking for money really was the whole plan, and for someone to fall for it. But why choose me? Or my apartment when there are about 14 others? Weirdly enough, I feel like he was nice to me. He was calm and didn't try to convince me to give him the money. He tried to get my parents and then my boyfriend to be his target. He took pity on me. Nevertheless, we've been sleeping with all our interior doors open to hear if someone tries to break into our apartment, and we try not to leave it empty for long periods of time. Living in constant fear, living the dream. I was about 12 years old and staying at my grandparents' house after my aunt's wedding. The house itself wasn't very big and was the same house that my mother and her sisters/brothers lived in growing up. After the wedding reception was over, my mum wanted to take me back to my grandparents for the night, so all of the adults could go out and get a couple of more drinks. When we arrived at the house, my mother and I both could very faintly hear a baby crying, with a woman trying to comfort the baby. Now the house isn't very big, so you can hear pretty much any noise in any point of the house. Our initial thoughts were that someone forgot to turn off the TVs in the house, so we both walked around the house trying to find the next TV that was left on. To our surprise, not a single TV or radio was left on, but the volume of the woman and baby remained constant. It didn't matter which room we were in. If we were in the basement or the landing, the volume of the lady and the baby was always constant. This, of course, scared the shit out of me, as I never believed in ghosts before this happened, but there was no explanation for it. Now my mother was a little freaked out as well, but she had a bar to get to. She then just told me that it was nothing, and got in the car and left me alone in the ghost house. I immediately turned the TV on with the volume set to high as possible, without busting my eardrums. I was exhausted, but drank pop to not let myself fall asleep and give this thing an opportunity to attack me. My parents showed up a couple of hours later to a kid wired on sugar just staring at the TV screen. I later told my aunt who grew up in that house this story, and she was ecstatic. She had always claimed that she heard a woman and a baby in that house growing up, but no one believed her. Ever since that day, I believe that something like ghosts exist in some degree. It doesn't matter how much evidence or data that people show me claiming that they don't. I know what I heard, and it gives me chills just thinking about it. At least mine was pretty nice, and didn't break glass or stuff like that. When I lived at home, my stepbrother and I stayed in the basement. It was made into more of an apartment by my stepdad. Bathroom, living room, kitchen, bedroom, and office. Oftentimes at night, I would see a girl looking to be between the ages of 7 or 8, running around near the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress and a red headband with long brown hair. I told no one about this, but then at a party I heard my stepbrother relaying that a little girl was running around the basement. He described her in the exact same way I did. I told my mum, and she thought we were crazy. I also started seeing a tall man in the basement. He liked to sit in a particular recliner, Around this time, I started to get questioned if I was sneaking my stepdad beer, and I was not. I did not want Coors Light, or even like it at the time. Fast forward a few years, and this keeps going on. I have moved out and went to college. Other siblings were blamed for sneaking beer. My mum and her friends liked to get together and do off-the-wall things. They decided one time to pay for the angel ladies to come over to someone's house. The first person cancelled, the second person cancelled, so it fell onto my mum as the host. This is where it gets fun. They came into the house and said it was an instant hotspot. They said a very tall man in a navy uniform was standing there with a little girl in front of him. He had his hands on her shoulder. My grandmother was also alive at the time and was just there for the fun and wasn't going to get read. The angel ladies wanted to read her, so basically they did it for free. So they do the readings in the basement. When it's my grandmother's turn, my mum joined her. They said that the man and little girl are there. After some time, it is determined that the little girl, who they are calling her angel baby at this point, is my aunt who died at the age of 3 or 4 of leukemia. So up until now, things have been overly personal, other than the matching the descriptions of the thing I saw. They said that the angel baby said, "I saw the angels, mummy," and my grandmother went white. She said the last thing she said to her was, "Do you see the angels, sweetie?" And my aunt said, "No, mummy, there are no angels," and then she died in my grandmother's arms. She also started playing with her hair and pointing to the closet. They said she wants them to know something about her hair. My grandmother revealed that we had a lock of her hair in the closet that she was pointing to. The angel baby was also asking for her dolly, which my mother revealed was upstairs on a church pew in the family room. We had a family room and a living room. No one ever went into the family room. It was forbidden except for Christmas. The angel baby then left, and the focus switched to the tall man in the navy uniform. And this is where it gets less interesting, as I forget the details. I've not heard many dealings with my uncle in the basement. Right off the bat, this was identified as my uncle, who died when he flipped his Jeep. He wasn't wearing his seatbelt, and his head came out of the window and went between the vehicle and the pavement. Anyway, he eventually reveals that he likes to sit in the recliner and drink beer. This was told without any prodding about strange goings-on or anything else. He also pointed at my mother and made the motion with his hand like "you owe me." They said something traumatic happened to her daughter, and that he was there and saw her through it, as a few years earlier my sister flipped her car, really good flip too, onto the front bumper. To this my mum exclaimed, "I don't owe him shit, he's drinking my beer and living here for free." Beyond this, I can't remember what else came out with my uncle. Now for the only scary thing that happened. On the way out through the front door, you have to walk past the family room. As my mum was saying goodbye, she glanced over and noticed that the church pew was in disarray and the doll was slumped over. Surely someone could have messed with it, but they assured her that they were not in there. Plus, I believed they were the last readings, and no one else was involved or listening. The fact that my uncle was with my sister when she wrecked her car makes sense in a way. He was a godfather when he was alive. My sister was 3 or 4 when he died, and my mum said that he is now her guardian angel. She took that as a fairy godfather and thought it was great. Me and a friend of mine were in my living room trying to sleep. She fell asleep at 1 a.m, and I stayed awake. A DVD player suddenly turned on by itself, so I sat up, turned my head around and saw a white glowing figure, a small face covered in a cape. It looked about 20 centimeters tall. I never felt afraid or intimidated. I bent over to get a closer look of the figure, and after about 20 seconds it faded away. That's when I started to feel scared. I turned the DVD player off and went to sleep. I know this wasn't a dream since my brother slept on a separate mattress, a few meters away from me and my friend. But he mentioned that he had seen me sitting up and bending over, staring at the bureau in the hallway. This happened 2 nights ago. Around 8 p.m, my boyfriend working night shift and the maintenance men finally got my new fridge in my new kitchen of our apartment. I had put all my food in the sink, but I had no ice to keep the food cool, so I called my sister. I was home alone and I heard a knock at the door. While telling my sister to get ice, I opened the door thinking it was one of the maintenance men. Maybe they'd left something behind that I hadn't seen yet. Nope. It was a drunk old man with a big jacket on, and it was way too hot for a big puffer jacket. Now I'm a 92-pound, 5'2" woman, and I am by myself, and don't have a job, as I'm an artist who sells her work, and this situation has never happened before. "Can I use your bathroom? I don't want to piss outside," he asks while stepping closer. I say, "I'm sorry, my boyfriend's in there taking a shower," and try my best to shut the door ever so slowly. He quickly grabs the door and puts his foot between the door and the wall. I freak out, push the door with all my might, and run for my metal bat in my room. By the time I got there and was ready to hit this guy, my sister was there with her friend with the ice. I dropped to my knees and cried. She said that when they got to the steps, he was running away. I didn't call the police, but if I see him again, I will. I should have been more careful. I told my boyfriend and he said, if no one has lived here for years and we live on the 2nd floor, why would he come to our door? That freaked me out so badly. When I was a kid, my brother and I would get stuck with babysitting the neighbor's kid. His name was Alex. Alex was really fond of my Lego set that I had up in the corner of my room, facing the window. He would play for hours, staying preoccupied, while my brother and I would play video games in the next room. So one night, when I fell asleep on the couch while babysitting, my brother came to me and said, "Alex is under your bed shaking." I asked, "What's wrong with him?" My brother told me to follow him into the room and try to talk to him to get him out from under the bed. I go inside to find that he is on the verge of tears and was trembling profusely under my bed. "Hey Alex, what's wrong? Why are you under there?" "Him," while looking at the sliding closet. As I walked towards the bed in order to help him out, he ran. He ran all the way back over to his house and waited on his front steps until his parents got home. Now, my parents went out to dinner with his, and he explained the whole story in detail to both his parents and mine. It sent a shiver down my spine. Here's what happened. My mum told me that Alex was playing with my Legos and heard a slight murmur from my closet, something that resembled a faint vocalization of, "Come here." He said that he looked behind him and noticed the closet had a slight opening, with light peering in from my lamp. He stared at the crack and he saw an eyelid open. He told us that there was a man in the closet. Alex then hid under my bed after he gave out a slight yelp. The family rushed back into my house into my brother's room. In horror, we find my closet door rocked open and a few things missing. My window had been left previously open when it was previously closed. A few things knocked over which had not been touched previously. We still don't know what force we're reckoning with after that evening. Thank God, nothing more severe happened. I've come to the conclusion that I am a magnet for creepy encounters, crazies, and potentially dangerous situations, probably because I can be incredibly naive. But regardless, let me share my most recent crazy encounter, which happened just before my much-needed vacation to Arizona. For starters, I would like to say that I'm a fairly attractive female. Blonde hair, blue eyes, about 5'2" and 125 pounds. So not super tiny, but definitely not very big either. I also can't seem to tell when people are genuinely being nice to me, or if they're flirting, as I am super oblivious, which may be the cause for what transpired. I won't disclose exactly where I work, but I will say that I work at a warehouse/club that you have to pay a membership to in order to do your shopping. Specifically, I work in the membership department, so I deal with new sign-ups, questions, issues with memberships, credit cards, angry members who demand they speak with a manager, or want to complain to you, even though you have no control over a policy. As part of the member service department, we are expected to always be super happy-go-lucky, friendly, and helpful. Granted, our entire company is dedicating to making our members happy, but the membership desk is supposed to be the Disneyland of our warehouse. What the member wants, we will bend over backwards to try and make it happen, which can lead to some entitled jerks when they can't get their way, and some incredible scary encounters. For reference on just how crazy it can be, I had one coworker get screamed at by a man twice her size because he was removed from the membership, which led to several other managers getting involved. A man who was the epitome of a serial killer and terrified members and managers, who was pushed by an angry member, and another member followed me around the store because she was mad that I only refunded her half her money, like I was told to do by my manager. But that's a story for another day. But most of the time, members are pretty nice about the situations that arise. My department is pretty close-knit, and despite us getting fairly competitive with our benchmark numbers, we're always there for each other and have each other's back, which I think is pretty important later on down the road for this story. So one day as I'm working, I have a gentleman come up to me with an issue about his membership/credit card. The guy, who I'll refer to as Chris, was probably around 6'2" to 6'3", of an average build with dark hair, dark eyes and a beard. He didn't seem to give off any creepy vibes, and was very polite as he tells me what the problem was. Apparently, he was trying to fill his bike up with gas. His membership/credit card wasn't being read properly, so he explains that he comes into town maybe once a week or so, and he's really only stopping at our store to fill up his tank. He also said that the card has his name on it, but it had his mum's membership number and her membership picture in the back, but that he is on her membership as her household member. I ask to see his card and driver's license, which he hands over to me as I type in the membership number to pull it up on our system. I continue to have a pretty decent conversation with him, as well as joke, as I was always the person to get weird and interesting issues with cards. Chris laughs, and after a moment points besides me and tells me that he knows one of my other co-workers, Tim, as they used to work together at a fast food restaurant, and if he ever gives you trouble, let me know. I laugh it off and brush it off, thinking it's just the sort of inside joke between Tim and Chris, and continue to search through the membership. Turns out, Chris isn't anywhere on the membership, nor does it appear as though he was ever on the membership, or any other membership either. Pretty weird stuff. So I call over a supervisor and show her the system, and explain the situation to her, all the while continuing to crack jokes and have friendly banter with Chris while he waits. She says his best bet would be to call the credit card company we're partnered with and figure out what happened to put his name on a credit card tied to his mum's membership. He says he can do that, then asks if there's any way he can still get gas. The supervisor says sure, and tells me to call the gas station to let the attendant know Chris was coming down there and that he'd need help getting the gas. I tell the attendant when he answers the phone that Chris would be coming down with a motorcycle to get gas, briefly tell him what happened with his membership, then let the attendant know he's okay to get gas today. He just needs help getting it. The attendant says it's okay. I hang up, and Chris thanks me after telling me that my name was very beautiful and unique. I thank him, tell him to have a good day, and he leaves. I figured that was it. Right? Wrong. Fast forward a few days. I'm closing the membership desk with Tim, and I'm not entirely sure how we got onto the topic, but Chris comes up in our conversation. Tim asks me if I remember Chris after a little description, and I say, "Oh, Chris, the guy with the really weird situation with the credit card and his mum's membership, right?" And then says something that made me uncomfortable. When he went outside for his break an hour or so after Chris had supposedly left, he ran into Chris hanging out by the front entrance. He says Chris flagged him down after sharing some brief pleasantries, and then Chris started acting a little twitchy and nervous, and says, "Hey, remember that girl who was helping me with my credit card? What was her name? She's cute. Is she single? I think she's got a thing for me, and I want to ask her out." Tim immediately tells him that, no, I'm not single, and that I'm just really nice, and that he probably misconstrued my friendly demeanor for something more. Tim then goes on to tell me that after he told Chris that I wasn't single, Chris became visibly upset, muttered something under his breath, and stormed off. Tim also told me, even if you were single, I still wouldn't have told him that you weren't. He's not that good of a guy. Dude's got some issues. Upon hearing this, my first reaction is to laugh nervously and brush off what Tim said as just a weird reaction. But on the inside, I'm freaking out. I've read too many stories and have watched too many crime shows to not think the worst, and I've had my fair share of insane encounters over the years to always be on edge. But I assume myself that nothing will come out of this situation, and I was just working myself up over nothing. Cut to Saturday, one of the busiest days for retail shopping. Membership and refunds are fairly busy, with anywhere between 5 to 15-minute intervals without members to give us downtime to clean, file paperwork and such. I'm having a pretty good day, just chatting with my coworkers and trying to be on top of everything, since it was at a slow period. We were running breaks, and our supervisor was doing some office work, so it was just me, Addie, Rick, who was filling up the kiosks, and Emmy, who was working on the returns that were trickling in. I was having a conversation with Andy and organizing the returns when I hear someone yelling at me from behind. Hey, I'm talking to you." I vaguely recognize the voice, but only when I turn around to see who's shouting at me. do I know who it is, and my heart drops to my stomach. Standing in front of me is Chris, who looks hella pissed off and disheveled, glaring at me with a menacing look, hoping maybe he just needs some help and it's nothing serious. I plaster my friendly customer service smile and I walk over to the computer closet to where he was standing. "Hi Chris, what can I do for you? Have another weird situation you need me to look at?" I force out a laugh, but he doesn't even crack a smile. Instead, he points a finger at me, and when he speaks, his voice is this super low murmur that only added to the creepiness / menacing factor. "You lied to me." By now, Addy seems to sense my discomfort and stands to the computer next to me, pretending to be working on something while listening in on the conversation. I tell Chris, "I'm sorry? What do you mean? Did the bank not figure out the issue?" He shakes his head and says that isn't the problem. I ask him what the problem is, and he says, You're the problem. You led me on." I'm sure my confusion is visible, and Addie and I exchange a glance. She subtly gestures if she should get a manager, and I subtly tell her no, before I turn my attention back to him. I ask what he means by that, and he states that I led him on when I knew he was flirting with me, because I was flirting back despite having a boyfriend, and that was a really horrible move. I say, "I'm very sorry if it seemed that way, but I wasn't flirting with you. I was just being polite. I didn't realize you were flirting with me. I'm sorry." He starts to become more upset, pulling at his hair, rubbing his face, and says, "No, you did know, and you were just pulling me along. I am not someone to be messed with like that, and you're gonna regret messing with me." At this point, Rick had come back from the kiosks, and Addie was quietly filling him in on the situation away from me and Chris, so that they wouldn't be overheard. Rick, who's a Navy veteran and a pretty large guy at 6'1" and heavy set, is watching Chris closely, and when Chris starts to seem threatening, he puts himself in the conversation. Rick asks Chris if there's a problem, but Chris ignores him and continues to berate me, while I stay quiet, too afraid to speak. He calls me a stuck-up something or other who's probably with some arsewipe, if I even was with someone. Typical nice guy, am I right? And that I could have had it all if I had just given him a chance. He continues to tell me that I wasted that chance the moment I led him on, and that he was going to make me pay. Chris then reaches over the counter and tries to grab my arm or slap me or something, but Rick pushes me to the side away from Chris, and Addie is on the radio calling for a supervisor or manager to come to the membership desk now. I remember seeing a front-end supervisor, Shadow, running from the cashier line to where the membership desk was, and I remember panicking, thinking that Chris might have a gun, and what if he tried to hurt someone with it? Meanwhile, as I'm worrying about what could happen, Rick is telling Chris he needs to calm down and not to speak to me that way. Chris then loses it and starts slapping his hands on the table and pointing at me, saying that I am a problem, and he has every right to speak to me that way because I was being horrific. Shadow finally shows up as Chris continues to spew crude insults at me, and Shadow, after realizing Chris was yelling at me and seeing how upset I was, quickly tells me to take a break, before radioing for someone to help at membership and asking Chris what the problem was. I start to leave, and Chris starts to follow me. After a while, Rick and Shadow start following Chris to stop him. I feel myself on the verge of a panic attack and start speed walking while Chris continues to shout at me. And then he pushes me. I manage to catch myself on the battery display, and Rick and Shadow catch him up and attempt to detain him as best they could. And Addie makes another call to the warehouse manager and to our security guard while passers-by watch the whole situation go down. Shadow tells me to go, and this time I run to the break room, where I have a complete breakdown, shaking and crying and unable to breathe as other employees on their breaks ask if I'm okay and try to help out. After maybe 10 minutes, when I had just started to calm down, one of the warehouse managers, Leonor, and the security guard comes in and asks if I can go with them into the office. I follow, and we go into the general manager's office and shut the door. They tell me to sit down, and after they ask me if I'm okay and ask what happened, to which I told them the entirety of the story, they told me that Chris got away. I am too shocked to ask anything other than, "How?" And they explained that not long after I left, and right before they arrived at the membership desk, Chris had managed to get out of the hold he was in and ran to the closed door beside the exit, which he pushed open to avoid the crowd, set off the alarm that Leonor had to shut off, and then booked it to the parking lot. They spent the next 5 or so minutes trying to locate him, but he was gone, and there were no cameras outside the warehouse to try and capture his license plate or anything else. And because of his strange membership situation, and because we only had his first name and a description of what he looked like, there was no way we could pull him up in the system to notify authorities. The only thing we did have was a grainy video of him getting hostile at the desk, following and pushing me, then assaulting Rick by elbowing them in the face and pushing Shadow back, which wouldn't be difficult since Chris was about a head taller and larger than the supervisor to get away. I was livid that he escaped, but also terrified, and the feeling of fear only escalated when Leonor said, "We want you to know that he threatened he'd be back." They offered to have a fellow coworker walk with me to the car at the end of my shift, which I was more than thankful for, and that they would have locked security be more vigilant in making sure no one strange came by our store when we were closed, until the situation was either closed or died down. There was nothing more I could do, and the most my work could do was to keep on the lookout for Chris and alert others if he came into the store again. I felt powerless. I still feel powerless. Always being on the edge and on the lookout for Chris is driving me crazy. I'm so paranoid I'll somehow run into him. The walk to and from my car, before and after every shift, is terrifying because I don't know if Chris is watching me. And if I think a vehicle has been following me for too long, I make random turns until I lose them. I'm scared Chris is going to come back to the store to find me when I'm alone and do something awful. The only peace I found was when I left the state for a week for a trip, but even then I was still a little paranoid. I keep my pocket knife close by at any point, and I'm planning on getting my concealed weapons permit just to feel safer. Does that make me crazy? It's been a little over 2 weeks since this whole situation went down, and I'm just praying that nothing sinister will come out of it. I spoke to my coworker Tim, who knew Chris beforehand, and he offered to talk to his old bosses to get Chris's information, so that we could give the police something to go on. From my understanding, the old manager didn't really want to give out Chris's information, but after Tim told him what was going on, and that the police are more than likely to get involved to keep him from hurting me or anyone else, he eventually gave him Chris's last name, a phone number, and an address, which we immediately gave to the police, and I filed a report. The only problem now is that they lead to dead ends. The first time I saw this person was in Caracas, Venezuela, when I was 6 years old. Her name was Leonor. She was a very old woman, invisible to others, who lives in my grandmother's house. She walks fast. At first, I only saw her through the doors, like a quick shadow running in front of me. Then one day, she stopped in the middle of the door. It was the first time I saw her face. I think it was almost every week. When I was a teenager, I even started talking to her. As a child, I came to tell my parents about the strange shadows, but they just said it was my imagination. I know it was very real. I have seen and spoken with Leonor many times. The last time I saw her was on my 18th birthday. Today, many years later, I get anxious and confused. I received an email from a website unknown to me. A cousin started a family tree with photos and everything. I'm shocked I saw Leonor. She was my grandmother's aunt. How is that possible? Does anyone else have any experiences like this similar? Let me start off this story by giving you a bit of background information. I'm a 19-year-old male currently living in Melbourne, Australia. Keep in mind that I'm pretty short for a guy, only 5'8", and not very muscular. As a result, I've always felt defenseless whenever I was confronted with people who were larger than me, which explains why I spent the majority of my teenage years at home, mainly because that's where I felt the safest. But in one moment of my life, that all changed. My entire perception on the notion of safety was completely and utterly destroyed. I was 17 when this took place. My parents had left for the weekend, as it was their 20-year wedding anniversary. I have 3 siblings, 2 of which are older brothers, both of whom have places of their own. My younger sister was staying at a friend's house during this particular weekend, so it was just me in the house. This is how I liked it. Nothing could prepare me for the fear that awaited me. There aren't words to describe the sheer horror I felt through my experience. On several occasions, I had read stories of people going through similar situations as my own, but never truly understood them until that day. It was around 11 p.m. on Saturday. I was watching my favorite TV show upstairs when I thought I heard a noise coming from downstairs. I paused my show so I could hear the sound more clearly. My suspicions were confirmed when I heard what sounded like a faint knock at the front door. Come to think of it, it sounded more like a tap. Now, I'm a pretty paranoid person, so I would often jump to the worst case scenario in these types of situations. But on this particular occasion, I just dismissed the sound entirely and continued watching my show. After finishing a few more episodes, I decided to go downstairs to get a drink. Just to give you an idea of the way my house was laid out, this staircase is located directly opposite my front door. Just left of the staircase is a very small hallway which leads into a larger room that contains my kitchen and the family room. In fact, the hallway is so small that you could practically see into the kitchen from the door. As I headed downstairs, I immediately noticed that the front door was unlocked. I knew this because the lock on the front door was positioned horizontally. This was a little alarming, as I could have sworn that I had locked it after my parents left for the weekend. In fact, I remember double-checking it to be sure. Like I previously mentioned, I'm a paranoid guy. In spite of this, I just locked it again and stupidly disregarded it. After I finished my drink, I decided to go to my bed because it was pretty late, and I have to admit I was very tired. Before heading upstairs, I turned off all the lights in the house, as this was routine whenever I went to bed. About 20 minutes into my sleep, I awoke to what sounded like the door closing downstairs. It couldn't have been the front door, as I was positive that I locked it before going upstairs. Plus, I knew that no one else had a key to the house other than my parents. Now, I've seen enough horror movies to know that you do not, under any circumstances, go investigate any unexplainable sound, especially when every gut instinct is telling you not to. But what I can say, in my sleep-deprived state, I made a misjudgment. I very slowly walked downstairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. I knew that a few of the steps made creaking sounds whenever weight was applied to the center of the step, so I did my best to stay as close to the edge of each step as possible. By the time I got to the bottom floor, my heart rate was higher than it has ever been in the circumstances. By this time, my eyes had adjusted to the dark, so I could make out the outline of the furniture scattered throughout my house. And still to this day, I believe that is what saved my life. Had I bumped into anything, it would have given away my position. As I slowly peered my head around the corner of the staircase, words cannot describe the sheer horror I felt when I saw the outline of a man standing in my kitchen. He was a very tall 6'5", well built, and I felt as though I was in a freezer as my blood ran cold. I was paralyzed with fear. I knew he hadn't seen me because he made no sudden movements or any change in his behavior that indicated otherwise. When I finally had the strength back in my legs, I forced myself to saunter backwards while trying not to make one sound, because if I did, I knew that I would be dead. The feeling a person gets when they know that each step they could take could be their last is a feeling I don't wish on my worst enemy. As I got closer and closer to the upstairs bedroom, I felt as though my heart had exploded in my chest, when a loud creak echoed through the house. At that moment, I knew I was screwed. My entire life flashed before my eyes in one fleeting image. I sprinted upstairs and closed myself in the bedroom. The worst part was knowing that none of the doors in the house had locks on them, not even the bathroom. All he had to do was to turn the wooden handle to my bedroom, and I'd be done for. The sound of boots thumping up the wooden stairs brought me closer to my death. I frantically looked around my room for anything to use as a weapon. There was nothing besides a pen laying on my desk. I grabbed it and held onto it so tight in anticipation that I actually started to feel the blood supply to my hand being cut off. I braced myself. The next thing I heard nearly made me throw up. I'll never forget the fear I felt till the day I die. A deep voice coming from directly outside my bedroom door which said, "I know you're in there, and I'm going to kill you." At that moment, the door burst open with force. Instinctively, I swung my arm towards it as hard as I could, and with a stroke of luck, I managed to drive the pen right into this guy's shoulder. He let out a blood-chilling scream and collapsed on the floor in agony. I used this opportunity to sprint downstairs and out the front door, where I immediately ran into my neighbor's house. I kept banging on the door until they opened up. After explaining what had happened, my neighbor called the police, and I waited with them until they arrived. By the time they entered my house to investigate, the man was gone. To this day, I still don't know if they ever found him, but fortunately, I have never seen him again. My cousin had a child about 8 years ago. My great-grandmother, a very beloved woman, all-around great person, my grandma Shaver, passed away while his wife was pregnant, and only about 2 weeks before she was due. This was a big deal for a few reasons. My cousin would have been the first of his generation on my mother's side of the family to have a child. Therefore, it would have been Grandma Shaver's first great-great-grandchild. 5 generations alive at the same time. It would have been pretty cool. But she passed away from a stroke, and it was very tragic. Fast forward a couple of years, my cousin and his wife are showing their daughter some family pictures. She's approximately 3 to 4 years old at the time, asking her, "Who's this?" and seeing if she remembers the names of aunts, uncles, grandmas, and grandpas. They sort of skip over a picture of Grandma Shaver, and she puts her hand on it and goes, "That's Grandma Shaver." My cousin said he was a bit uncomfortable, but asked, "Do you remember hearing us talk about her?" And according to him, his daughter looked him right in the eyes and said, "No, but she visits me and talks to me all the time." He said he didn't sleep right for a few weeks. Good thing we're all sure if she is a ghost, she's probably the most kind and gentle ghost there is. Still creeped me out. I don't live in the greatest area, nor in the nicest apartment, so I'm always kind of checking my surroundings when I'm out and about. Nothing crazy, but just being aware of what's going on around me. This being said, the other night I decided that the mountain of dirty clothes inhabiting my closet was bordering on disgusting, and it was time to do one of my least favorite chores, laundry. I don't mind doing laundry itself, but the laundry room in this building always gives me the creeps. It's in the dank and dark basement of the building, and you always have to grope the wall for the light switch. It would really make an excellent location for a horror film, to be honest. So I go down, throw my laundry in the machine, and everything is fine and dandy. I come back 40 minutes later to throw it in the dryer. Nothing out of the usual. Yet. An hour later, I go back down into the basement to collect my stuff out the dryer. Well, when I turn on the light, the dryer door is open, and my shit is all strewn about. On the ground, hanging out of the dryer, and to top it all off, they're still wet. Which was the worst part, because I didn't want to have to keep coming down to the laundry room because I'm a lazy shit. Normally I'd be like, whatever, because sometimes people open dryers and just don't close them. But this really looked like someone rummaged through my stuff. Shrugging this off, I put my stuff back in, and that's when I get a sharp chill running down my back. It was so random. I genuinely felt like I wasn't alone. So I turn around back to the elevator, and all of a sudden I hear the sound of someone frantically running up the stairs on the other side of the room, almost as if they had been spotted. I get all my laundry back to my apartment, and notice I'm missing some stuff. But at this point I'm kind of creeped out, so I'm not in the mood to go down snooping around for some t-shirts. So I kind of just forgot about it, until a couple of days later. I received an email from our landlord telling all the residents that a homeless guy not only broke into the building, he performed sexual acts on himself in the laundry room, and then started a fire and went around the building trying to break into people's unlocked apartments. So I'm guessing this guy went through my stuff, probably took something, did God knows what with it, and then started an actual fire. As a kid, I used to have awful nightmares every night, as well as the occasional night terrors. It had actually gotten so bad that I never slept for more than 4 hours a night. I think it was thanks to a mixture of the sleep deprivation and general paranoia that I began seeing things out of the corner of my eye. And usually there'd be nothing there when I'd do a double take. Once though, while I was walking through a hallway in my house one night, I turned, and there was actually something there. It was tall and looked like a smoky, wispy silhouette, except for the yellow eyes, which looked very solid and bright in the low light. I've never felt the same level of dread as I did in that moment. I used to be religious, and I didn't know until years later, but my church had actually told my father that something with yellow eyes was tormenting me. It made my skin crawl when he told me, because I never actually told him about it. At some point it stopped, and I grew up and mostly forgot about it. A few months ago, I took my preteen sister to see a midnight showing of a horror film, and afterwards, we began talking about our weird and creepy experiences and tried to rationally explain them. Mostly everything had some sort of logical cause, until she told me that when she was younger, she used to see shadow people out of the corner of her eyes. I laughed and told her it was funny, because I had seen some too. It stopped being funny when she told me about how she was watching TV in our house during broad daylight, while she had stayed home, sick from school. She was home alone when she heard something down in the hallway. She turned and saw a wispy, tall silhouette with shining yellow eyes. I had a rough time sleeping that night. This happened to me last Thursday, and I can't stop thinking about it. I'm a 30-year-old female who lives with my fiancé and our 2 dogs. I have 2 huskies, one is 2 and one is only 4 months. My huskies are not guard dogs, to save their lives. They don't bark nor howl. These dogs just love people too much. My brother-in-law and friends have walked in on multiple occasions, and the dogs don't make a peep. So anyway, it's 8 p.m, it's dark out, and I'm home alone. My fiancé had a hockey game, and I'm in the bathroom with the door closed and the blow dryer going, so I can't really hear anything going on around me. That is, until I hear one of the dogs howl. I stop the blow dryer and listen, thinking that the dogs are fighting again. Then I hear a faint knock, and the dogs start going apeshit. Barking, howling, jumping into the bay windows, so badly that I thought they'd break it. I think, what the hell is making them go crazy like that? Maybe it's another dog or skunk. I look out my bedroom window, as it was the closest view to the front door for me. Well, lo and behold, there are 2 men in black hoodies, standing there in the front. They start knocking loudly, and this time my 2-year-old husky jumps from the bay window to the front door and starts growling and ramming his body into the door. I'm watching this from my bedroom as the dog jumps into the door. One of the men jumps back startled, looks at the other guy, and they just walk away. I called my fiancé to get home ASAP. I watched them walk away down the road. They weren't selling anything, and they didn't stop in any of the houses. I was so creeped out. Thank goodness for my crazy dogs. When I was a younger kid, I had a really hard time getting to sleep, and I normally got to bed really late at night. My mum has always been that way too, so my mum mentioned that she heard something at night, and she wanted me to stay up a little longer to hear it. I did. It was summer anyway. Fast forward to the night. It's about 1 in the morning. My mum said it usually happens during her nighttime routine, so she told me to sit in the living room and listen while she went to brush her teeth. That's when I heard it. There were footsteps upstairs. You could hear the footsteps start at the window in my parents' room, then walk away towards the other bedroom, my baby sister's. It sounded muffled until the footsteps arrived to the landing of the stairs. Then it got louder because the landing was hardwood floor. After a few steps, you then heard the footsteps on the carpet again, when they arrived at my sister's room. By this time, they didn't go all the way to the window. They went to my sister's crib and paused for a moment before continuing back to the window in my parents' room. I listened to this for about 5 to 10 minutes, with the footsteps taking about a minute to go to the window to the crib and back. My mum then came out of the bathroom and said, "I told you I heard something." Well, we then opened the door and it stopped completely for the night. The next night I did the same thing and heard it again. So I open up the doors and send our dogs up, who get to the top of the stairs and immediately turn around and bolt down. My stepdad was there that night and quickly ran upstairs after the dogs came down and looked everywhere. There was not a single place he didn't look. There was nothing to be found, and the windows were not locked. Couldn't explain it for years, and the neighbors that moved in after us apparently heard the same footsteps. This has been happening over the course of the last few days. I've been a little shaken up by it. A bit of backstory. I just moved and left everyone behind in Florida, and I'm about 1,600 miles away, so I'm living alone with just my dog. I've been working at this place for 2 months now, and at my old store, I never had this problem. I work at a popular restaurant / fast food chain, and there's this guy who comes in every day. As per new company rules, we have to be overly nice to customers, and they want us to be on first name basis with our regulars. Whatever, I can do that. I'm actually really good with customer service. So we introduced ourselves the other day. He's a really nice guy, easily 37 to 42 years old, and I found out last night he's actually 47. I came in the other day to work, and I patted him on the arm as I walked by, and said hi, because I'm nice. Well, this past Thursday, he comes in and instead of sitting in his usual spot with his coworkers, as they all sit near our takeout window, which is where I was working, this guy gives me his business card, tells me to text him later, winks, and sits down, and proceeds to casually look over at me and watch me occasionally. I told a few of my managers, and everyone laughed at me. I was so uncomfortable until he left. I went home and started to think maybe I had overreacted to the situation and tried brushing it off. I mean, the guy just assumed I was interested in him because I was being nice. Right? Fast forward, the creepy guy got worse. He came in, and I was on the cash register, so I had to interact. First thing he said to me was, "I'm sorry if I was too forward the other day." I said it was fine, and started ringing out the next person. He left. I went to our takeout side again, and lo and behold, he's sitting there. Great. I try avoiding him at all costs, but he's fully on staring. He waves at me and asked why I never texted him. I showed him my hand with a fake engagement ring on it. My mum's boyfriend and I agreed this would be the easiest way to stop this. This is why me being alone is important. They're both back in Florida and can't help me much. And he said, "Oh," and left me alone. Then he came up and asked for more ice cream, and someone else got it because we knew he just wanted me to get it, so he could talk to me again, as he had asked me directly. He then came back and asked for toothpicks to me again, and someone else fetched them. Then he left, and the coworkers were starting to understand why I was freaking out. Fast forward to later that day. I'm off at 4 and it's 3:15. He comes back for a bag of chips. Alone. He sat in the corner where I couldn't see him, and he moved to the takeout window again, then moved back to his hiding spot. Then he came up to the window while I was there. I said, "Hey." He didn't even answer. Just stared at me for a solid 30 seconds, then walked away. And then I saw him leave. I was relieved, but had to have someone walk me to my car and went to buy pepper spray. All the while, my general manager was making fun of the situation the whole time, and another manager that didn't witness this guy said, "I don't believe that. He's a nice guy," and my coworker Jen went off on him. The one most messed up part of this, my manager refuses to ban him from the store, after admitting that what he was doing was creepy. I spoke to my old manager back in Florida about it, and said after the first incident he'd have banned the guy. So, I'm still forced to interact with him. So Dave, despite the fact I'll probably see you tomorrow, let's not meet again. I was about 5 or 6. We were living in a rented house that seemed normal enough, but strange things started to happen shortly after we moved in. My older brother liked doing these huge 500-piece puzzles, and he would put them together on the floor of our bedroom, and they started getting messed up during the night. Everyone naturally assumed it was me, but it wasn't. Not long after that began, I started to have really bad nightmares about a woman in her early 20s. She was wearing a white cotton nightgown with violet flowers on it. She had long, wavy, tangled black hair, and was swaying from the ceiling light, and she would always stare at me with a look of pure hatred. It got so bad that my parents took me to a therapist who said that I was having night terrors. About a month after the night terrors started, we moved to another house suddenly. My parents claimed it was because they found a house closer to my dad's work, and just like that, the night terrors stopped, and my brother's puzzles were being left intact. It wasn't until 15 years later, visiting the family, that I found out the truth. My mother was talking to one of our neighbors about my night terrors, and she said that another family with a little girl rented the place a few years before us, and she had the exact same nightmares, right down to the nightgown with the pretty purple flowers. The neighbor also mentioned that no one seemed to stay in that house for more than a year. My mother thought it was way too much of a coincidence, so she started asking around and found out from an older couple in the neighborhood that a young woman had killed herself in the house in the early 60s, as my experience took place in the mid-80s. My mother went to the library and looked through the microfiche and found the news articles. It turns out that the girl in her early 20s had mental health issues and was being cared for by her parents, who had gone into her room in the middle of the night and saw that she had hung herself by the ceiling light. I never got to see the picture they had of the girl in the paper, but my mum said she had long wavy black hair. I'll never forget her eyes burning through me and her face distorted in silent rage. I had a great-grandmother who had a house similar to ours. She was the sweetest thing ever, and even at the age of 108, beat me at rummy. She had an estate, situated on a small drop next to a wooded ravine. The house was very old-fashioned, with 3 wraparound balconies for each floor of the house, all connected with metal staircases. Honestly, probably the worst estate for an elderly woman to live in. We used to have Christmas at her house, and all the kids would go down to the basement to play pool or pachinko. As the years went on, eventually it was just me and my siblings in the basement each get together. I was the youngest, so I was the slowest. Whenever it was time to go upstairs, my siblings would race up the stairs and turn the lights off. Each time they did this, I felt a horrible, sinister presence rush towards me in my mad dash up the stairs in the dark. When she passed away, my cutthroat family descended on the estate like vultures. I was about 20 and despised the whole thing, but I went with my grandpa to see the damage of everyone's greed with him. It was really sad to walk around the house with him, seeing everything his kids and her husband's kid had taken. My great-grandfather was in fact my grandfather's step-grandfather. He was genuinely disappointed and hurt. I couldn't help but feel for him and share in his disappointment. When I saw the table that me and my great-grandmother played rummy at had been taken only a few months ago. Then we went down to the basement. The familiar surge of unpleasant energy was present, but not overwhelming. We looked around my great-grandfather's office and saw it was stripped clean, except for some filing cabinets. The only other thing was now the broken pachinko machine. Then we entered my great-grandfather's workshop, which I had no idea existed in the basement. Unlike the rest of the basement, this area didn't have giant windows and was only poorly lit by some track lights. Shelves of tools were everywhere. It was like a small warehouse. The feeling of dread washed over me, and I fought the urge to get out of there. Rusty circular saw blades mounted on the walls. Generally a very poor place for kids to hang out right next to. I never spoke of the basement with anyone, but it just didn't feel right. It felt like something was down there, suppressed, but angry, and violated. Maybe that's the reason my great-grandma was always super religious. She was the one who sent us to a Christian summer camp after all. So, I grew up in Las Vegas. I'd moved there when I was in 2nd grade. I was around 7 or so. My mother was working at some sort of motorcycle repair shop in Arizona that just wasn't paying the bills all that well. So she jumped at the offer of a new job. Fast forward about 5 years. I'm in middle school now. My brother and I were almost exactly 2 years apart. I was about to turn 12, so he was 10 at the time. My mother, being quite low on the seniority list, was forced to work late nights. That left me and my brother home alone after school more often than not. Our nights were usually pretty uneventful, usually consisting of us avoiding whatever homework was assigned, warming up leftovers in the microwave, and watching whatever sparked our interest on the TV, which was usually either WWE wrestling or some kind of cartoon. We usually ended up in bed before our mum got home, but occasionally, we'd wait up for her. One night, or I suppose one afternoon, considering it was still broad daylight, everything was pretty normal. My brother sat on the living room floor, engulfed in whatever was going on the TV, and I was using my mum's desktop computer feeding my virtual pets. Then there was a rather aggressive knock at the door, which was very odd. I was sort of an outcast child. I didn't really have too many friends, nor did my brother. Even then, we lived in what you would consider a senior living community. My mother was the youngest adult there, and was around her mid-30s. My brother, being too short to reach the peephole, doesn't move, and only slightly reacts and looks at me. I get up from the computer chair and make my way to the front door to glance out the peephole. I see a man in a black ski mask staring back at me through the peephole. It definitely didn't seem real. It sort of seemed like something from a cliché movie, as if he were dressed to rob a bank. I was immediately scared shitless, and I obviously didn't bother asking who it was. I silently stepped away, shut off the TV, grabbed my brother and our small black Pomeranian, and ran back towards my bedroom. Once we were safely hidden in my closet, I informed him of what was outside. He didn't say much, but was visibly shaken up, just quietly stood there holding our dog. I slid the tiny flip phone our mom left us for emergencies from my pocket and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator the entirety of the call, as I didn't think the man had left, considering the knocks persisted after we left the living room. Yet somehow, she understood me and sent an officer over. Immediately after the call ended with the operator, I dialed for my mother. I explained everything to her, and she ended up leaving work early and came home around the same time the police did. I'm not sure what deterred him from pursuing further, but of course the man had gone by the time they both arrived. The officer was very clearly not taking any of it seriously, most likely thinking that these two young boys were just paranoid from staying home alone. It was probably some young man playing a joke on some of his friends. However, like I stated previously, we lived in a senior living community. Who could possibly be playing a joke on us? His dear grandmother? He then gave my brother and I stickers, as if that would console our nerves after seeing some masked man pounding on the door. Fortunately, I never saw the stranger after that. After that experience, my house, however, was broken into, as well as my car 3 times, but thankfully none of us were present when all of this took place. Since then, my family and I have moved out of state and have installed a security system. I worked in an old Civil War fort turned tourist attraction. I was working there during the Halloween festival as an unpaid volunteer character to scare people. I was a pirate. Anyway, this was pretty far up north, so October was cold as hell, and they had these big drink dispensers of hot chocolate for us all. Ours ran out, so I volunteered to go find our boss and get a refill. I ventured off into the dark parts of the fort that were closed off to visitors for the evening to find the supervisor. It was dark as hell, with only the light coming in through the old arrow/gun slits on the walls, and started to make my way down what is called Two-Step Alley. This is a very long hallway, named for the fact that every 15 to 20 feet, there are 2 small steps up, as it was built on a slight slope. This hallway is at least 100 feet in length, if not more. There are 2 entries, one at either end, and there are no alcoves, no doorways, no windows large enough to crawl through. It's just a single straight shot. So I get all the way to the end of this hall, and around the corner is a man dressed in a fantastic Civil War/soldier's uniform. I mean, it was amazing. I remember being really impressed by it, and giving the guy a nod as I went past him, and him looking at me right as I looked at him. I turned the corner, then paused and thought, oh hey, maybe that guy knows where the boss is. So I turned around and peeked back, just to say, hey, do you know? But he was gone. Just gone. The hallway was way too long for him to have made it to the other end without sprinting. And I would have heard that, because this place is echoey as hell. I found out later that apparently, while the fort never saw battle, it did have run-ins with winter deaths, as well as the nasty flu outbreak, and issues with diphtheria. This happened when I was about 17 years old. For context, I am a 21-year-old girl. At the time, I was working at a failing seafood restaurant. I was a busgirl, so I had to deal with touching people's old, half-eaten seafood all day long. I'm a vegetarian, and have never liked anything that comes out from the water, not even shrimp. Working at a restaurant can be a super interesting job. The amount of people you meet through work is immense, and your coworkers can become like your family. You're all suffering together, and you can all become pretty close. The chefs at the restaurant were pretty strange. One was super chill and was always drunk and angry, and the last, well, he was something else altogether. To make things easier, I'll just call the creepy chef Creep. So Creep starts working. He's new, and he seems like a decent guy. He's in his mid to late 40s, salt and pepper hair, and nothing throws you off by seeing his physical appearance. I deeply love everything 60s and 70s, and so Creep and I would often talk about music, especially rock and roll. He seemed like a cool guy, someone who claimed he saw so many of the bands that I drool over daily. It seemed nice to work with someone who generally shared the same interests as me. So weeks go by, and Creep wasn't showing any signs of anything strange. I felt totally okay within my workplace, wouldn't blink an eye, and actually enjoyed the job. Me and a fellow busgirl became pretty close friends. We bonded over the fact that we both had pretty messed up family lives, so we instantly became work buddies. The restaurant was slow. Me and the busgirl were having a conversation, laughing, smiling, and joking in the kitchen. This changed in less than 5 seconds, when Creep came right behind me and says this in my ear. "This wouldn't be so funny if I had chloroform." I turn around to look at him, thinking, why the hell are you saying weirdo jokes like that? His eyes were blank. He was staring at me, but I felt as though his eyes were burning an imprint on my face. This staring lasted a few seconds, but eventually I just turned and walked away. Throughout the next week, the Creep would stare at me through the kitchen window while I was working. I tried to avoid going to the kitchen, but that was nearly impossible when it was my job to transport dishes from the tables back to the kitchen. Twice more, while in the kitchen, the situation repeated itself. I was talking to a fellow coworker, and Creep would drop whatever he was doing and interrupt the conversation with, "Well, it wouldn't be so fun if I had chloroform on me." At this point, he had mentioned chloroforms to me 3 times. I was freaked out. Luckily, I stopped working there a few weeks later, because I was leaving to travel Europe for the summer. When I returned, the restaurant was already shut down, so I didn't see Creep ever again after this. I wish I would have told my manager at least. I don't know what I was thinking. I clearly wasn't. No one should ever have to feel that threatened at their workplace. This story happened to my dad. Now, my dad has never been one to make up stories, and he can't even share this story without getting goosebumps. It happened about 6 months ago, when my parents were on vacation at a friend's beach house. Our friends always told us about the place next door, and that it had 5 new owners over the past 3 years. The guy who last lived there actually committed suicide about 3 weeks before this, but we don't know why. My parents just arrived for the night. Everything is fine all day until they're getting ready for bed. My dad starts to smell gas. Turns out the pilot light went out, so he goes outside to turn the gas off. While he's outside, he started to get chills, and the entire time outside he felt nervous. Once he found the shutoff, he hears someone say, "What are you doing?" The voice was so real and pronounced that he actually responded with, shutting off the gas. He then realized what he just did and froze. Looking around, he saw no one. He thought it was my mother at first, but after freaking out and running inside, she was in the bathroom brushing her teeth. My dad couldn't sleep that night at all, and they ended up driving home at 3 a.m. They told our friends, the house owners, and they looked mortified. They told us the guy who committed suicide not too long ago did it by gassing himself in the house. My dad can't tell this story without getting goosebumps. I don't think I've ever seen my dad legitimately scared in his entire life. He gets fear in his eyes when he told me for the first time, and that's something that he can't fake. Never in my then short life had I ever really considered the concept of actual fear. I loved horror movies. My father was constantly renting them for me, despite my mother's protest. I loved that sort of fear. The tingle in your stomach when the music starts to get tense and the character in the movie does not see something behind them, and you're anxiously awaiting the climax of the sudden jump. That is a fun fear. What I felt that autumn night when I was 8 years old was much, much different. I grew up in north of Toronto, in a really beautiful town. We had a gorgeous, big, 2-story house that even now, 17 years later, I still consider home in a strange way. It certainly was not a small town by any means. It wasn't quaint, and wasn't the sort of place that everyone knew each other and where no one locked their doors. In general, though, it was safe. There was the occasional stranger danger stories that would circulate about kids seeing someone in the forest or ravines or areas surrounding the town. Being a family of all girls, we were taught the basics: always lock the doors, never talk to strangers, and never accept rides. It was the beginning of fall, where the maple tree leaves started to turn amazing reds and oranges, and it would get dark much earlier. It was around 8, and the sun had already fully set. My parents and older sister were all out, leaving my middle sister Kay and I home alone. Kay decides she wants to have a friend over, and wants us to walk and meet her halfway. It was realistically only about a 5-minute walk to get there, although at the time, it seemed like a huge adventure. Kay could not find her house. We searched for a while, with no luck. While she continued searching, I remembered my parents kept a hidden key in the garage for emergencies. In this particular house, there was no direct door connecting the garage to the house. You had to open the actual garage door to get it. Or there was a side regular door. Since I had no key, I opened the garage door. I remember very clearly finding the key, and as I got back to the keypad to close it, I saw headlights. I anticipated seeing a familiar vehicle, seeing my parents or my sister arriving home, but that was not what I was met with. Pulled halfway up my drive about 10 feet from where I was standing was a beige Montana minivan. I heard the slight sound of a window rolling down, a car door opening, and my eyes finally focused on the figure of a man, one arm fully out of the window, along with his torso and head. He held the door ajar too, easy access to jumping out if he decided to. He was a big man, completely bald, shaved down to the skin, shiny sort of head bald, and he had a thick soul patch on his chin. It was probably only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity until he finally spoke. I remember there was a lightness to his voice. I think at the time, it probably took a friendly tone, but as an adult now, I wonder if it wasn't a more sickening excitement he may have felt at the opportunity he saw. Are you home alone? This is the fear I was talking about. a muscle-stiffening, stomach-churning fear. This is the sort of fear you see in horror movies, where the person is too afraid to move. That physically freezing fear is what I felt. I was 8 years old and tiny. I had no chance. The garage was empty, the driveway was empty, no cars, no signs of adults, no hope. I felt like I was outside my body, watching this happen to another little girl. It wasn't happening to me. I couldn't be taken or hurt. That sort of stuff doesn't actually happen. I heard this weird echoing noise coming from somewhere, my body still frozen. It wasn't until he was hurling himself back into his vehicle and squealing his tires as he violently reversed off my driveway that I realized my sister had opened the front door. I assume he didn't want to take a chance of who could have been opening the door, so he took off. My parents eventually came home, and the police came and we filled out our report. Nothing came of it. No man was ever found, and the stories raged in our neighborhood of the occasional creepy encounters that other kids had. I have no idea what may have happened had my sister not come to the door at that moment. I try not to imagine what a grown man in a minivan could have done with a tiny 8-year-old girl. I know some people hate these whole let's not meet endings, but hey, when in Rome, I hope to never ever meet the man I saw that night again. I hope to God no other little girl does either. I was living with my best friend, and I will call her Amanda. We lived together in an apartment. Amanda and I would work different times of the day. I worked mornings, and she worked nights. So I would be by myself at night. I would hear different noises around the apartment, but I thought nothing of it. But there is one room in general that stands out. That's Amanda's room. She has this closet that I would hear noises in, but I would not dare to go in there. But then one night, I was cleaning before bed when I heard the closet door crack open, and I almost shat my pants. When I saw an outline of a person, I booked it out the door, and I'm a grown man that's not scared, but that really did scare me. I messaged Amanda telling her everything, and she said she saw outlines of people in her room and thought it was just her imagining things. I looked to see what time it was. It was 3 a.m, and she said she'd be home any minute. Then I saw Amanda's car pulling up. She ran up to me and asked if I was okay. I told her no, that I was scared, and she let out a scream I will never forget when she saw a group of transparent people looking at us through a window. We drove so fast out of there, I couldn't even remember where we were. The next morning, we packed up all our stuff and left. Now, me and Amanda had got married and had one son, and we had never experienced anything like that ever again. Has anything like this ever happened to any of you guys? It was my first time staying home alone while my whole family was out at my brother's ball game. I was 13. Anyway, I'm on the phone with a friend of mine feeling so grown up when someone beeps in on the other line. I tell her I'll be right back and click over lines. Then the creepiest voice I've ever heard says, "Hello, little girl. I'm the man in your basement." Honestly, I laughed it off and just hung up, thinking it was a prank call. I was a pretty confident little thing, and my neighborhood was pretty safe, so I figured someone was just messing with me, knowing it was my first time alone. They beeped in again, so I clicked over and heard, "Don't you hang up on me, you little," and the lights started flickering, and there was banging under my feet. I know it sounds crazy, but my dog started freaking out and my cat ran away, so I assume I wasn't imagining anything. Our basement was actually just an area connected to the garage. It wasn't finished. I heard what sounded like footsteps coming up the garage steps to get into our kitchen, and I threw stuff in front of the door and heard yelling and whatnot. I kept trying to hang up and call the cops, but every time I tried to, he was still on the phone. My friend told her parents what was happening, and they ran to the neighbor's house to call the police for me. I sat petrified with a broken rifle, a butcher's knife, and a baseball bat behind my front door, because it's the only place in the house downstairs that can't be seen from a window, crying. Eventually, I clicked over the phone to hear a police dispatcher on the phone and stayed on the line with her until the police arrived. There was no sign of forced entry, though we had a broken window pane on our outside garage door that had been messed up for months prior, and my guess is that he used that to get in. The police assumed I was just a paranoid girl, and they were going to leave me home alone after they gave me the all clear. Fortunately, a family friend had been driving by and saw the cops, and they all stopped to see if everything was okay. He gave me a ride to the school where my family was. They were skeptical that anything had happened, but we did get a security system not too long after that, and my parents both got cell phones too, as this was '94. After that happened, I swear there was someone stalking me for years. I would leave my apartment locked and bolted, and come back to find appliances, like my hairdryer or stove, maybe heat on, in the middle of summer. I lived in 4 different places, and would get strange phone calls at every one, despite being unlisted. Cars would randomly be parked down the road from the house, and speed up and slam on the brakes, and I would run inside. I'd hear bangs outside where I lived, even when I was out in the country. Nothing has happened since I've been in my current home, and I'm married, but I am paranoid all this time. When I was around 3 to 5 years old, our electricity went out, and my family stayed at a friend's house. My brother and sister would play with the kids, but I didn't. I would play with a girl in a butterfly garden, but when I tried to show my mum, her mum said, "Sweetie, no one is there." I shrugged it off, thinking she was just playing since I was young. When I was playing with the girl, I would talk to a man in all black, and would always call him the man in black. I feared him, but liked talking to him. The thing is, the only thing I could truly remember about both of them was they both died by drowning in a lake that was nearby. This happened a few months ago in the dead cold winter. I remember being home alone. My parents had gone out to the bar for their friend's birthday, and my little sister was at my cousin's house for a sleepover. My dog and I were the only two in the house, which is sometimes a bit scary for me, because it's late at night. I don't really like being by myself, mostly because I would have no way to defend myself if something happened. I'm a 15-year-old, 5'1" girl, and I can't cause much damage. I'm also a very overly paranoid person, which sucks with these situations. It was probably around 11 PM. I got up from watching something on my laptop to get snacks and feed my dog. When I came into the kitchen, my dog was staring at my back door and growling. Our back door is glass, so when I looked outside, all I saw was black. "Do you want to go outside?" I asked my dog. But she just continued to stare and growl at the door. I shrugged it off as her being in a defensive mood for no reason, or she saw an animal. She's a little dog, but she thinks she's tough. I grabbed a snack out of the pantry and went over to my dog by the door. I picked her up and take her into my room when our motion-activated light turns on. I looked up expecting to see an animal scurrying away, but oh no, I saw the figure of a man. He was wearing a black hoodie, and I could barely make out his face. I knew he was staring at me. I stared at him, and he ran off, hopping over my back fence and into my neighbor's yard, leaving tons of footprints in the snow. This freaked me out. I began to cry, and I called my mother, who was slightly drunk, and told her what I saw. She began to freak out over the phone, and I heard her talking to my dad. They both told me they'd be back, but to call the police in the meantime. I hung up, dialed 911, and explained what happened to the dispatcher. She calmed me down as I was having a pretty bad anxiety attack, telling me that it would all be okay and the police would be there as soon as possible. I heard banging on the door after what felt like hours, even though it was probably only 10 minutes. The police began talking to me. I was a tiny bit calmer than I was before. They explained to me that they would inspect the backyard and wait for my parents to get home. My parents finally got home. They weren't too far, which was good, and the police told them a patrol car would be staying around here. They explained to my parents that a house about a mile up had recently been robbed while the owners were gone. The footprints they found in the snow matched the ones that were at the other house. This freaked my parents and I out, of course, but the police assured us that they would be on the lookout around this area. I never found out what happened to the man, but I hope that he got caught. I found out my uncle was in the hospital because of his heart problems, and they had caught up to him. So my family and I called the hospital, and we spoke to him. He always could make any situation bright. He had the best sense of humor. He was always making jokes, and I was trying to laugh and not cry, and trying to spot words out through the tears. We had to hang up before I could say bye or I love you or anything. And the next day, we got a call saying how he died and that he wanted us to know first. The next morning I woke up. My eyes flew open, and I don't know why, but I saw an orb banging on the walls of the house. I had a feeling that it was him, so I asked, "Are you my Uncle Dennis?" It responds with floating over the picture I have of him on my wall. Then I hear a whisper in my ear, "Because it wanted to. It has his rights." That was the ending to our favorite joke that could make me smile at any time. It's not so much creepy, but it felt good that he was okay. I miss you, Dennis. My family moved into a house about 2 years ago, and we found out one of the previous owners died in the dining room. No big deal. I sit at the table to eat. No one else in my family does. We know her name. L is what I'll use. Occasionally we'd make jokes like L moved something. My mom watches paranormal things and believe Elle has attached herself to me, because I'm the only one who sits in the dining room. One day over a year ago, I had burning on my stomach after eating there, and lifted up my t-shirt to find 3 scratch marks. I wasn't concerned because I'm not afraid of Elle, but my mum was freaked out. Fast forward to last week. I was in the basement to do laundry, and heard a guy whistle a tune for 30 seconds straight. I froze and felt like someone was behind me. I didn't look, did laundry, and ran upstairs. I waited for my brother to check the basement. There was nothing, and I told my mum. The very next day I went back down to the basement, and when I come up, my mum says it wasn't funny, as she thought I was whistling, and that she had heard it through the vent. When she heard it, I wasn't in the basement, and it wasn't me. She said 10 seconds of a tune, and we checked the basement, but there was nothing. There's an owl statue down there that my dad got, but we don't know where from. It's very creepy, and was the only thing behind me that first night. My mum said we're getting rid of it. We carried it outside but accidentally dropped it, shattering it to pieces outside the house. She thinks she set the ghost free, and it went into her. Again, she watches a lot of paranormal shows. I said maybe she let it free. We haven't had any problems since, but we also haven't gone into the basement. She wants to burn sage, but I'm unsure. I also don't understand why this stuff happens out of the blue, and your thoughts would be appreciated. My auntie lives with her employer. She used to babysit the employer's kids, which are now fully grown adults. That's why she lets her live with her. My auntie's been working for her since 1994. One of the doors on the left of the house leads to the bathroom, and the other door leads to the living room. The house has about 3 living rooms. The door is very old and big, and has a lock, but I didn't lock it obviously, because I didn't need to. I started hearing someone trying to open the door. My auntie is a tomboy, so then I went under the bed to surprise my auntie. But when I looked up, I saw a woman with long black hair and a white dress. Her hair was covering her face, but I could see that her skin was as white as sunscreen. She stayed standing there for a minute and then left. I was more surprised than scared, but now I would have crapped my pants. Has this happened to anyone else? This happened several years ago when I lived with my ex-boyfriend. We had recently moved into a 2-bedroom house and set to work turning it into a home. We turned the back bedroom into an office, as the house only had the 1 bathroom, and it could only be reached through this bedroom. We would have people crash on our sofa pretty regularly, and didn't fancy them have to traipse through our bedroom to get to the loo in the middle of the night. So we'd be living there for roughly 1 month when this event occurred. My ex was out with work colleagues, and I was home alone. I'd spent the early evening watching TV and eating takeout. A couple of times I heard some strange noises, but whatever. I would try and zone in on them to figure out what the hell it was. It would stop. It got later, and I decided to go upstairs and use the computer for a little while before heading to bed. At this point in time, we hadn't had our phone line installed, and I was still on a pay-as-you-go phone, which had run out of credit. I basically had no way to communicate with anyone whilst I was in the house that night. So I'm sitting in the back room with only a small table lamp on that barely forms a glow, whilst I'm typing away on my laptop, when I heard noises again. It started as a light rattling noise, really faint, to the point I had to strain to see if I was really hearing it or imagining it. I shut my music off and tried to figure out what it was. I went into our bedroom and looked down to the front door. Nobody there. Go back into the back bedroom, but can't see much out the window. We had a small yard with a huge brick wall and a solid wooden gate, with nothing to cast any light. But from what little I could see, there was nothing out back there either. I sat back down and switched the music on. Maybe 10 minutes later, I hear this eerie screeching sound like metal on metal. Again, very faint, as if whatever was making it was trying to desperately be quiet. I was getting more than a little freaked out at this point, so I went into our bedroom to retrieve this heavy iron rod that we'd found when we built the back of the wardrobe. I didn't switch on any lights, as I knew that was going to alert any possible intruder to my location. Remember, I had no way of calling anyone, and I was getting more than a little concerned someone might actually be in my house. I made my way back into the office/bedroom and closed the door as quietly as possible, before bolting it and lodging a chair under the handle. Nothing more happens for a good 20 minutes or so. I start to feel a little foolish for letting myself get worked up, and put it down to being alone for the first time in the house. But I don't switch the music back on this time, which was lucky because I started to hear what sounds like two people whispering, both male voices. They didn't sound like they were coming from inside the house though. I had the office/bedroom window open ever so slightly, and the sound seemed to be floating in from there. I headed into the bathroom to see if I could get a better look into the alley that the house backed onto. The office/bedroom and the bathroom formed an L around the yard, with the bathroom extending further out. I climbed up onto the ledge and inched the window open to try and see out into the alley. I couldn't see a thing, but the whispering was loud and coming from directly behind my gate. I couldn't hear whole sentences, but heard enough to summarize whoever these men were. They'd seen us move in, and I'd seen we had quite a lot of valuable equipment. Guitars, computers, DSLRs, TVs, gaming consoles. I imagined they'd seen I was home alone, and had been waiting for me to go to sleep and try to get into the house. I'd stayed perched there for what felt like an eternity, until what seemed like the loudest thud in the world echoed up to me. They'd grown tired of trying to be stealthy, and one or both of them were throwing themselves at my gate, trying to break it down. I could see it shuddering under the blows, and could only imagine how large these men must be. I'm a tiny girl, all of 5'3", and at this point weighed somewhere around 105 pounds. As you can imagine, I was white with terror. As I watched my gate groan from the stress, I sat, clutching that iron rod, trying to think where I could hide from them. Suddenly, a glaring light blinded me. At first I panicked and dropped out of sight, thinking they were shining a torch at the back of the house, but then I heard barking and shouting. I peeked out the window again, and saw the house, which was across the alley from us, had a floodlight installed, and it was illuminating both their own yard, mine, and the alley with the light. I heard grumbling and footsteps as the two hurried down the alley. I stayed locked in that back bedroom until my ex-boyfriend drunkenly rolled in at about 4 a.m. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and when I went into the yard in the morning, my gate was hanging on by one hinge, allowing easy access from the alley. When I looked at the back of it, the keyhole was covered in scratches, as if someone had tried to force the lock. If they hadn't woken the house behind us, I dread to think what would have happened. It's not something I tell people on a daily basis, but when I was little, I woke up to a banging on the window. At first I figured it was just the wind and tried to shrug it off and go back to sleep. But I kept hearing footsteps in my room. My room had a large enough area for you to walk in circles in front of the bed. You know, the kind of noises that are just supposed to be the house settling? It sounded like someone was circling my room. I used to sleep with the radio on, and at this very moment it was playing a very depressing song that I can't remember the name of, but if I hear it on the radio I still get the creeps. So that really started scaring me. The room also felt as it were getting colder. At this point I was really scared, and I decided to make a run for it to my parents' room down the hall. As I passed through the area where the footsteps were, I got so incredibly cold that I could see my breath, and froze for a second only to hear the words, "I'm lost." I bolted to my parents' room and hid under their bed and cried myself to sleep. Back in high school, I went homeless for a time and had to crash on my friend Kate's couch in the basement. It wasn't the most comfortable situation, but it was better than sleeping in my car. or so I thought. I awoke in the dead of night, and I had to pee. So I flung myself up from the bed and saw a 10-foot tall, skinny shadow just looming over me. Keep in mind it was pitch black in this room, yet this thing was so dark, I could still make its form out. I felt this intense rot and dread, and I felt like it was looking right at me. I blinked, and then it disappeared. I called my other friend Andrew and asked to go stay over there, and noped the hell out. A few months later, I was back to living with my parents, and Kate invites me over to go sleep over and chill out. But I ask if it's okay to bring another friend, Ethan. So Ethan drags his dog along, and we all go into the basement where I saw this thing. Immediately, the dog starts going apeshit the moment he gets down there. He just begins running around and barking. Ethan was really confused as why his dog was acting like this, and goes, "I'm sorry guys, I don't know what got into him." But me and Kate knew. We knew exactly what was going on. So we told Ethan what was up, and that what I saw wasn't some fluke. So Ethan gets the idea that we should look for an object or something down there that maybe this entity could be tied to. After about 2 hours, we come up with nothing. We start to think maybe it's the house. Then Ethan spots something. A bunch of thumbtacks in the wall in a really weird pattern. So then Kate pipes in. "Hold up, maybe it's trying to tell us something." It's now 3 a.m. in the morning, and we're searching for dialects the thumbtacks could be. Eventually we find it was Morse code. So I ended up translating the Morse code, and it spat out coordinates. The location was only 40 minutes away. It was this volleyball field. After we found out what the thumbtacks were, his dog finally calmed down, and the dread that filled us lifted. We never found out what was there, but man, there was something seriously wrong in that basement, and we never went to check what was in the volleyball court. I'm a smallish 20-something-year-old female that works in a medium-sized, usually safe, town. With that being said, my office is in one of the bad parts of town. There was a recent stabbing just down the block, and some nearby drug/human trafficking issues. I should also note that I work with sex offenders, so I'm not easily creeped out. Because of our office location and clientele, we usually keep our office door locked and have a buzzer that alerts us when someone comes in. On to the story. The other day I needed to briefly stop by my office to pick up some forms before an early morning meeting. I was running late, so by the time I got to the office, I was frazzled and in a rush. Since I was only going to be there for a few minutes, and no one ever came to my office that early, I didn't lock our entrance door. Spoiler, this was a bad idea. I'm doing my thing when the door buzzer goes off. Our office space is shaped weird, so we can't see our entrance from most other areas. I was surprised, but just assumed one of my coworkers came early. After a few minutes of not hearing her usual friendly greeting, I went to check. The man was standing in the lobby. As you can imagine, it wasn't who I was expecting. This guy looked like an Italian Martin Short, so I'm immediately on edge because something about him seemed off, and he had a creepy-ass grin on his face. He stated that he worked with a different company in our building, but no one was there, so he was wondering if he could use our phone. This set off another red flag, because the other company in our building opens extremely early and always has people there. I lied to him and told him we didn't have any office phones because I didn't want him following me to my office. He then started rambling about how he needs to call someone or else he'll be stuck here for hours. Then he changed his story and said something about driving an hour away to the worksite if he can't make this call. The rambling didn't make sense, and the story kept changing slightly. It didn't seem like he was confused or on drugs. It seemed like he was trying and failing to make up a story on the fly. Partially because I was in a rush, and partially because I hadn't had my coffee yet and wasn't thinking clearly. I decided to give in and let him use my cell phone. At this point, I was pretty confident this was a ruse to steal my phone. But whatever. It was old and crappy anyway. He starts telling me the number to dial, but when I'm halfway through punching the digits in, he pulls out his cell phone and looks up the rest of the phone number. This guy had a cell phone in his pocket the whole time. But I tried to rationalize and thought maybe he's not financially well off, and he doesn't have a cell phone with service. He makes the call with my phone, and there's no answer, so he thanks me then leaves, setting off the door buzzer again. Relieved he's gone, I go back to my office to finish up and head out. A few minutes later I head back through the lobby to leave, and the guy is back again. I didn't hear him come back into our lobby because this increasingly creepy creeper never shuts the door after leaving the first time. The buzzer only goes off when someone opens it, not when someone closes it. I'm positive he left it open intentionally so he could sneak back in without the buzzer going off. He asks to use my phone again, but I'm pissed at his sneaky bullcrap and tell him I'm leaving and he needs to leave too. We both leave without incident. However, before I drove past the parking lot, I checked my rear view to see where he was. He was talking to someone on his cell phone, watching me leave. In my culture, if someone dies in a violent way, we should burn their clothes immediately. My uncle, who was a degenerate loser and predator, died in a fitting fashion. He was dragged by a car and thrown into a ditch. The coroner's office released his clothes that he was wearing at the time of death. My uncle warned his sister, my mother, and his wife not to look at them, but they got curious and wanted to see. I followed them down the stairs, and they made me stay outside the room while they were snooping. While we were down there, we heard a smash upstairs, and we ran upstairs to see a bunch of glasses that were shattered and no one in the house. My aunt and mother were spooked, but didn't think much of it. This house was in the middle of nowhere, and it was the middle of winter. Our wakes are 24 hours long, and someone must always be with the body. A family friend was leaving the wake and drove by the accident scene. She says that what she saw was my dead uncle, and he smiled at her in a very unsettling way. We woke up next morning, the last day of the wake, and a day before the funeral. My uncle was rattled. I heard him tell my mother and aunt that he heard the crunching of boots on snow. It was 4 a.m. He went outside with the shotgun and no one was there. My aunt and mother came clean about what they'd done. My uncle said he warned them. They started a fire and disposed of the bloody clothes. He was buried the next day, and no one bothered them again. I experienced the 3 knocks on my bedroom door in the middle of the night while hanging out with a friend and my brother. We lived in bedrooms in a half-finished basement, mostly concrete. It was 2 a.m, and we were just hanging out staying up late when we heard a knock on the door. 1, 2, 3. I said come in, but nothing, so I forgot and continued to socialize. When the knocking happened again, 1, 2, 3. This time we were like, who the hell is it? Got up, opened the door, to nothing. That's when we got freaked out. My mum was sleeping upstairs and could hear her snoring to high heaven. No one else was in the house except for us, and all the doors were locked. So we kind of start freaking out. We shut the door and just sit there. The knocking comes again. 1, 2, 3. But then this time it's accompanied with a doorknob turn. 1, 2, 3. My brother is a bit braver than me, so he approaches the door and peeks below. This is an unfinished basement, a crappy one at that, and the door has a clearance on the bottom of about 3 inches. So he peeks and he makes out a shadow. It's dark beyond my bedroom in the basement. The shadow seems to sit there, but not coming off or anything. And then he looks at the knocking and turning of the doorknob, and it starts again, over and over, until we start screaming, yelling for our mother, my friend yelling her name, and the knocking and turning didn't subdue until she descended the stairs and opened the door. She yelled at us and told us to shut up. It never did happen again, and we never found out what it was. My ex-stepdad came to visit a few weeks later from Washington State and said he had a tall bearded man sometimes in his peripherals down in the basement. I looked up the 3 knocks, and it's called the death knock. No one's died of yet, and this was 14 years ago. I live out in the middle of nowhere with my mum and 2 sisters. We had all gotten into a massive fight over pizza of all things, and my mum and 2 sisters stormed off and left me home alone. I was very angry. I'm not going to go into the details of the argument, as thinking back on it, I was wrong and it was pathetic, which as a moody teenager is something quite hard to admit in the heat of the moment. Nonetheless, I wasn't in a good mood, and I was sitting there in the dark in my room, sulking in my fury. After about an hour, I had got bored of doing nothing, so I began playing some video games on my phone. My family hadn't come back yet, and I speculated, given the length of time they'd been, that they had probably gone to visit our grandparents. That's what they usually did on a Friday night anyway. I sat there entertaining myself, when all of a sudden I started hearing something. It was coming from the background. It was like people were approaching the house, a continual buzz of noise and talking. I poked my head past the curtain and looked out the window to see a bunch of people walking towards our house from the woods. They were all wearing black robes. The thing is, I thought it would be scarier, but because of the laughter and the continual talk, I wondered who they were and why they were dressed so oddly. They didn't feel remotely threatening. I watched tentatively from my dark room, and they all seemed to stop at the house. That's when I realized they weren't here to carry on walking. They'd come with a purpose, and outside my house they'd stopped and were starting to inspect it. I assumed, in the heat of the moment, that they were there to practice some kind of ritual, maybe some kind of cult, and that I was their chosen victim. I tried telling myself it was bullshit, and thought that I should call my mum, but I was still pissed, so I decided against it, thinking I could brave on the cult alone. The fury was still pumping through my veins, and I was angry. So I rushed downstairs as I heard people fiddling with the locks. I went and grabbed all the kitchen knives I could and held them out like Freddy Krueger style. I opened the back porch door, taking the people who were fiddling there completely by surprise, and yelled out incredibly loudly whilst holding knife in hand. I wasn't sure what was going to happen. Perhaps I was just feeling ballsy because of my fury, but my screams echoed through the night. and the person just stared at me and went, "Sorry, wrong house," and the group quickly dispersed and ran back into the woods. I couldn't believe my luck. I had single-handedly chased off the cult. And after a few hours, when my family got back and the adrenaline had worn off, I apologized reluctantly and then told them about my encounter. Of course, none of them believed me, and it was quickly dismissed and forgotten about. But about 3 years later, in the local news, reports that a group of hooded individuals were going to people's houses, causing harm and stealing stuff. There was even a case where they found a guy dead, stabbed in the woods. I wonder if I hadn't have taken them by surprise, would I still be alive today? Would my fury have cost me my life? Could they have come into the house and ended me? Some things are best not dwelling on. During my high school years, my friends and I had a thing for ghost hunting. We would always drive out into the country and explore old abandoned houses, just trying to scare ourselves. At the time, my mother worked for the Girl Scouts at the main office, and it was located in one of the oldest buildings in town, which was rumored to be an old children's home. My mum told me that many employees believed the building was haunted by a little girl. One of the employees had to go to the office late into the evening to finish some work and took a 4-year-old with her. She was sitting at her desk, which was located next to the main staircase, when she noticed her daughter standing at the bottom of the stairs. She asked her what she was doing, and she replied, "Can I play with her, Mummy?" The alarm had to be disabled by her mother when they arrived, so they know for sure that no one else was in the building at the time. This story gives me chills, as there's no reason for a toddler to lie about something like that. I remembered this story and asked my mum if she would let us in the office at midnight one night. We took our camera and started roaming the office. It's a very large, old 3-story building with many offices. Each footstep could easily be heard with loud creaks. After exploring the upper floors trying to spook ourselves, we decided to enter the basement. The entrance to the basement reminded me of a scene straight out of a scary movie, with graffiti and random sketches on the walls. It was a very small basement, with wooden joists supporting the floor above us. We found some old books covered in dust and started to read them. I had the camera in my hand, which provided the only light in the basement. After reading about 3 sentences, we heard footsteps directly above us, as if someone was walking down the first floor hallway. I whipped the camera up, and you could actually see the floorboards moving, as if someone was stepping on them while walking, and dust falling down. I instantly got the hell out of there, and pissed off my friend when I forgot I had the only light. We actually had it on film, and watched it over and over again that night. It was the freakiest thing that's ever happened to me. It was over 10 years ago, and I wish I knew where the film was. My dad and auntie have told me this one on separate events, and both accounts were the same. When my dad was about 16 in the late 70s, he and my auntie were waiting in my grandparents' waiting room at the front of the house, just outside my grandparents' bedroom, where my great-grandfather lay dying. The room had 3 exits, one that leads to my grandparents' bedroom, one that leads to the rest of the house, and the door that leads to the front garden. And there was no breeze at all, especially from anywhere in the house. My aunt felt cold, so she got up to close and lock the previously ajar wooden door, and sat down. About 3 minutes later, my grandmother lets out a wail as my great-grandfather died. And, at that exact moment, both my aunt and father testify the sturdy wooden door flew open and slammed shut, as if someone had stormed out the house angrily. It couldn't have been the wind, as the way the door opened and closed was exactly how an enraged person would slam the door. I've asked them both separately, and they both gave me the exact same details. I was a utility locator. I used to work on a team with my dad. To find a gas service from the gas main to the house, you must connect the equipment at a gas meter. Many older homes have the gas meter in the basement. Sometimes, I would be the one that would connect the equipment, while my dad found the gas service. In this particular day, we get to a house that had the meter in the basement. I go up, knock on the door, and the homeowner points me in the direction of the stairs to the basement. I go down, and I see the gas meter in the corner with 2 walls built around it, making it like a closet with no door. Behind the gas meter is the old crawl space halfway up the cinder block wall. There are no lights in the crawl space. I step into the closet area, and I hear what I can only describe as a demonic growl come from the crawl space. I step out, call my dad, and I don't want to sound spooked. I just say I need a flashlight. He hung up, I stood outside the doorway, and just reached in and hooked up the equipment. My dad comes downstairs with the flashlight, and as he steps through the door to see if I got it in the dark, that same demonic growl comes from the crawl space. He about knocked me over trying to get me back. He hands me the flashlight and goes back outside. I just stood there pointing the flashlight into the crawl space, with a feeling that something was watching me. He calls and says he's done. I grabbed the equipment as quickly as possible and got the hell out of there. I don't know what it was, but I've never heard a growl like that before or since.